Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is David Jones, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Badlands, near Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my co-workers. The idea came from Michael Williams, our sales manager, during a particularly brutal week at Henderson and Associates Accounting. "We need to get out of this office before we all lose our minds," he'd said, loosening his tie as he leaned against my cubicle wall. "I'm talking real wilderness. No cell towers, no Wi-Fi, no spreadsheets." Jennifer Williams, no relation to Michael despite the shared surname, had laughed from her desk across the aisle. "You wouldn't last 2 hours without your phone, Mike." "Try me," he'd shot back with that competitive grin that made him so successful in sales. "I know this perfect spot near the Little Missouri River, deep in the Badlands. My cousin Jake took me there once when we were kids. Nothing but canyon walls and sagebrush for miles." Robert Johnson had looked up from his computer screen, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. "Statistically speaking, most missing persons cases in national parks occur in remote backcountry areas with limited cell service." "Jesus, Rob," Jennifer had said, rolling her eyes, "you're such a cheerful guy." But Robert had continued, as he always did when he latched onto a topic. "I'm just saying we should be prepared. Proper supplies, emergency protocols, someone back home knowing our exact location and expected return time." That should have been our first warning. 2 weeks later, we were loading Michael's pickup truck with camping gear outside my apartment building. The October air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and the weather forecast promised clear skies but dropping temperatures. I'd spent the previous evening obsessively checking and rechecking my pack. Sleeping bag rated for 20 degrees, headlamp with extra batteries, water purification tablets, first aid kit, emergency whistle. "You're worse than my mother," Jennifer teased as she watched me redistribute weight in my backpack for the third time. She traveled light, just the essentials crammed into a worn canvas pack that looked like it had seen more adventures than the rest of us combined. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the kind of hiking boots that had actually been used for hiking. Michael emerged from his apartment building carrying a massive pack that looked like it could supply a small expedition. "Better to have it and not need it," he said, though I noticed he was already breathing hard just from carrying it down 3 flights of stairs. The drive to the Badlands took 4 hours, winding northwest through increasingly desolate countryside. We passed through small towns with populations in the hundreds, grain elevators standing like monuments against the vast sky, and endless fields of harvested wheat that stretched to the horizon. "Turn left at the next cattle guard," Michael said, consulting a hand-drawn map that looked like it had been folded and unfolded 100 times. "Jake said there's an old ranch road that leads to the trailhead." The ranch road turned out to be little more than 2 tire tracks separated by a strip of prairie grass. Michael's truck bounced and lurched over ruts and rocks, the suspension groaning with each impact. After 20 minutes of bone-jarring travel, we reached a rusted metal gate with a faded "No Trespassing" sign. "This is it," Michael announced, though I couldn't see any indication of a trailhead. Beyond the gate stretched an empty valley hemmed in by eroded canyon walls the color of dried blood. "Are you sure this is legal?" Jennifer asked, but Michael was already out of the truck working the gate's ancient chain and padlock. "Jake said the rancher doesn't mind hikers as long as they don't mess with the cattle. Besides, look around. You see any cattle?" He had a point. The valley looked utterly abandoned, a moonscape of alkali flats and wind-carved stone. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through sagebrush and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above the canyon rim. We shouldered our packs and set off across the valley floor, following what might have been a game trail or might have been the remnants of an old cattle path. The terrain was more challenging than it had appeared from the truck, loose shale that shifted under our boots, hidden gullies that appeared without warning, and thorny bushes that caught at our clothing with every step. "How much farther to the river?" Robert asked after we'd been walking for an hour. Sweat darkened his shirt despite the cool air, and his breathing was labored. Michael consulted his map again, frowning. "Should be just over that next ridge." But when we crested the ridge, there was no river, just another valley, identical to the one we'd left behind. The canyon walls seemed to press closer here, casting long shadows despite the afternoon sun. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," Jennifer suggested, though there hadn't been any turns to take. The trail, such as it was, had led straight across the valley floor. Michael studied his map with increasing confusion. "This doesn't make sense. The river should be right here." I pulled out my phone to check our GPS coordinates, but the screen showed no signal, not even an emergency-only indicator. "Anyone else have service?" 3 phones, 3 blank screens. In an age of ubiquitous cell towers, we'd found one of the last dead zones in America. "Well, this is cozy," Jennifer said dryly, but I caught the slight edge in her voice that suggested she was feeling the same growing unease that had settled in my stomach like a cold stone. We pressed on, reasoning that water flowing through desert country would make itself known by the green ribbon of vegetation that always followed rivers in arid regions. But as the afternoon wore on, the landscape remained uniformly brown and lifeless. The sun was touching the canyon rim when Robert called a halt. "We need to make camp," he said, consulting his watch. "Another hour, and we'll be setting up in the dark." None of us wanted to admit we were lost, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. We found a relatively flat area sheltered by an overhang of red sandstone and began setting up our tents. The silence was oppressive. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the brush, just the constant whisper of wind that seemed to carry voices just below the threshold of comprehension. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" Jennifer asked as she drove tent stakes into the hard ground. "Desert's always quiet," Michael replied, but his usual confidence sounded forced. Robert was assembling his tent with the methodical precision he brought to everything, each component carefully inspected before use. Actually, desert ecosystems typically support a diverse array of nocturnal species. Bats, owls, various rodents, coyotes. We should be hearing something. As if summoned by his words, a sound drifted across the valley, a long, mournful call that raised the hair on the back of my neck. It wasn't quite a howl, wasn't quite a scream, but something uncomfortably between the two. "Coyote," Michael said quickly. "Didn't sound like any coyote I've ever heard," Jennifer muttered. We cooked dinner over Michael's compact camp stove, the blue flame providing a small circle of normalcy in the gathering darkness. The food, dehydrated camping meals that promised to taste like real cuisine, turned to ash in my mouth. Every few minutes that strange call would echo from somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp, always from a different direction, always seeming closer than the last time. "Maybe we should take turns keeping watch," Robert suggested as we cleaned our dishes. "Watch for what?" Michael asked, but he was already rummaging through his pack for his headlamp. "Just watch," Robert replied quietly. We drew straws from a handful of dried grass. Jennifer got first watch, midnight to 2 a.m. Robert would take 2 to 4, I'd cover 4 to 6, and Michael would bring us to dawn. It seemed like a reasonable precaution, though none of us wanted to articulate exactly what we thought we needed protection from. I was settling into my sleeping bag when Jennifer's voice cut through the night. "Guys, you need to see this." We emerged from our tents to find her standing at the edge of our camp, staring up at the canyon wall. Following her gaze, I felt my blood freeze. High up on the rock face, perhaps 60 feet above us, a pale figure stood silhouetted against the stars. Human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall and thin, arms hanging at an unnatural angle. "What the hell is that?" Michael whispered. Robert raised his binoculars, adjusting the focus with trembling fingers. "I can't quite. The shadows are too deep, but it looks like..." He lowered the binoculars, his face pale in the starlight. "It looks like it's watching us." We stared up at the figure for long minutes, but it remained motionless as carved stone. When a cloud passed over the moon, plunging us into deeper darkness, we lost sight of it entirely. When the moonlight returned, the ledge was empty. "Maybe it was just a rock formation," I suggested weakly. "Shadows playing tricks." "Rock formations don't watch people," Jennifer said flatly. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and broken. I kept waking to the sound of that otherworldly call, sometimes distant, sometimes so close it seemed to come from just outside my tent. Once, I could have sworn I heard footsteps circling our camp, but when I worked up the courage to unzip my tent flap and look out, I saw nothing but empty darkness. Morning brought little relief. We woke to find our campfire reduced to cold ashes despite banking it with enough coals to last until dawn. More disturbing still, our GPS units had gone haywire, displaying coordinates that placed us simultaneously in 3 different states. "Electronic malfunction," Robert said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Solar flare activity can interfere with satellite signals." We broke camp in uncomfortable silence, each of us dealing with the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The planned 3-day excursion was beginning to feel like a mistake of potentially fatal proportions. Michael consulted his hand-drawn map again, rotating it this way and that as if a different angle might make the terrain match his expectations. "If we head south," he said finally, "we should intersect the Little Missouri River within a few miles." But south proved to be a relative concept in the maze of canyons and ridges. What appeared to be a clear path would dead-end at an impassable cliff face. Passages that looked blocked from a distance opened into hidden valleys that led nowhere. By noon, we'd covered perhaps 3 miles and seemed no closer to finding the river. "I think we're going in circles," Jennifer said during a water break. She was studying the landscape with the analytical eye she usually reserved for personnel evaluations. "That rock formation with the 3 spires, I swear we passed it 2 hours ago." I looked where she pointed and felt a chill of recognition. She was right. The distinctive red sandstone spires were unmistakable, and they'd definitely been on our right side when we'd passed them earlier. Now they were on our left. "That's impossible," Michael protested. "We've been heading south the whole time." Robert pulled out his compass, checked it against the sun's position, and frowned. "Actually, according to this, we've been walking northwest for the past hour." "Your compass is broken," Michael said, but there was a desperate edge to his voice. "Let me check mine," Jennifer said, producing a backup compass from her pack. It pointed in the same direction as Robert's. We stood in a loose circle staring at the evidence of our bewilderment. 2 compasses, both indicating we'd been walking the wrong direction despite our careful attention to navigation. The sun overhead seemed oddly positioned, not quite where it should be for the time of day. "We need to get out of here," I said, voicing what we were all thinking. "Something's wrong with this place." "Places don't just malfunction," Michael said, but his usual bravado was cracking. "There has to be a logical explanation." That's when Robert screamed. We spun around to find him staring at something beyond a cluster of boulders. His face was bone white, his mouth working soundlessly as he pointed with a trembling finger. What he'd found was a campsite, or rather the remains of one. A circle of stones marked where a fire had been, and scattered around it were the remnants of camping gear. A torn sleeping bag, its insulation scattered by wind and weather. The aluminum frame of a backpack, twisted as if by enormous force. Clothing that might once have been brightly colored but was now faded to the gray-brown of old bones. And bones there were. Human bones, picked clean and bleached white by sun and scavengers. A skull grinned up at us from beside what had once been a camp stove, the eye sockets dark and empty. Jennifer was the first to recover her voice. "How long do you think they've been here?" Robert knelt beside the remains, his scientific training overriding his fear. "Hard to say without proper examination," Months, maybe years. Desert conditions preserve and destroy simultaneously. "We need to report this," I said, though the words felt hollow. We were beyond the reach of cell towers, beyond the reach of help. "Report it to who?" Michael asked. "We don't even know where we are." That's when we heard it again, that strange, mournful call that had haunted our first night. But this time it was different, closer, and unmistakably coming from something that wasn't a coyote. The sound seemed to wrap around us, echoing off the canyon walls until it was impossible to determine its source. We gathered our gear and fled. For the rest of the afternoon, we pushed through the maze of canyons with something approaching panic. The discovery of the remains had shattered any illusion that we were simply dealing with navigation problems. Whatever had killed those previous campers was still out there, still hunting. The calls followed us, sometimes distant, sometimes terrifyingly close. Once, I looked back to see a pale shape moving through the rocks parallel to our path, matching our pace but staying just out of clear sight. "There," Jennifer said suddenly, pointing ahead. "Is that water?" Through a gap in the canyon walls, we could see a ribbon of green vegetation that might indicate a stream or river. We scrambled over loose scree and through a narrow passage between towering rock faces, emerging into a hidden valley where water trickled through a bed of polished stones. "Finally," Michael breathed, dropping his pack beside the stream, "the Little Missouri." But Robert was shaking his head. "This isn't the Little Missouri. That's a major river. This is just a seasonal creek." He was right. The stream was barely 6 feet wide and probably knee-deep at its center. Hardly the river we'd been seeking. "It doesn't matter," Jennifer said pragmatically. "We have water and we have daylight. We make camp here and figure out our next move in the morning." We set up our tents in a defensive cluster near the stream, each of us hyper-aware of every shadow, every sound. The normal routines of camp life, cooking, cleaning, organizing gear, felt surreal after the day's discoveries. As darkness fell, we built up our fire higher than necessary, the flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like grasping fingers. None of us spoke about taking watch shifts. Sleep seemed impossible. That's when Michael announced he was going to gather more firewood. "I'll come with you," Jennifer offered, but he waved her off. "There's deadwood scattered all over the valley floor. I'll just grab what's close and come right back." He picked up his headlamp and disappeared into the darkness beyond our fire's circle of light. We heard his footsteps crunching through dry grass, growing fainter as he moved away from camp. Then silence. "How long has he been gone?" Robert asked after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. Jennifer checked her watch. "Too long for just gathering wood." We called his name, our voices echoing off the canyon walls. No response. I grabbed my own headlamp and stood up, but Jennifer caught my arm. "Don't," she said quietly. "Whatever's out there, it got Mike." We stay together. We huddled by the fire for the rest of the night, feeding it every scrap of burnable material we could find without venturing far from camp. Every hour or so we called Michael's name, but the darkness swallowed our voices without response. Dawn brought no relief. Michael's tracks led away from camp toward a cluster of dead trees, but they simply ended in a patch of bare stone as if he'd vanished into thin air. "People don't just disappear," Robert said, though his voice lacked conviction. We spent the morning conducting an expanding search pattern, staying within sight of each other at all times. We found nothing. No trace of Michael, no indication of what might have happened to him. It was Jennifer who suggested we try to reach the canyon rim. If we can get high enough, maybe we can see a way out of this maze, maybe spot a road or a ranch building. The climb was treacherous, loose rock shifting under our boots with every step. We roped ourselves together with the climbing cord from Michael's abandoned pack, each person securing the others. The canyon wall was nearly vertical in places, requiring us to chimney up narrow cracks in the stone. 3 hours later, we pulled ourselves over the rim and onto the plateau above. The view that greeted us defied comprehension. We stood at the edge of a vast depression in the earth, a crater-like formation that couldn't be seen from ground level. The valleys and canyons we'd been wandering through formed the interior of this geological anomaly, a hidden world cut off from the surrounding plains. "That's impossible," Robert whispered. "This isn't on any map. Something this size would be a major landmark." But there it was, stretching for miles in every direction, and scattered throughout the maze of canyons below were other camps, other vehicles, other groups of people who'd found their way into this place and never found their way out. "Jesus Christ," Jennifer breathed. "How many people are down there?" I was counting the visible camps when movement caught my eye. Far below, near our campsite by the stream, a figure was moving through our abandoned camp. Even at this distance, I could tell it was human-shaped, but there was something wrong about the way it moved. "Is that Mike?" Robert asked, raising his binoculars. The figure seemed to sense our attention. It stopped moving and turned to look up at us, though from this height it should have been impossible to see three tiny figures on the canyon rim. Robert lowered his binoculars, his face gone white. That looks like Michael, but something's wrong with his face." We watched in horrified fascination as the figure below raised one arm in what might have been a wave. Then it turned and disappeared into the rocks near our camp. "We have to go back down," Jennifer said quietly. "If that's Mike, he might be hurt, confused." "That's not Mike," Robert said with absolute certainty. "I don't know what that is, but it's not our friend." The descent was more harrowing than the climb. Fear drove us to take risks we never would have attempted in calmer circumstances. We slid down loose scree slopes, rappelled down cliff faces, and squeezed through cracks barely wide enough for our bodies. When we finally reached the valley floor near our camp, the sun was setting behind the western rim. Our camp looked undisturbed from a distance, but as we approached, the wrongness became apparent. Our tents had been rearranged, moved closer together in a tight cluster. The ashes of our fire had been stirred and reshaped into a perfect circle. And sitting beside the cold fire pit was a pile of firewood, neatly stacked. "Mike?" Jennifer called softly. "Mike, are you here?" A voice answered from inside one of the tents. Michael's voice, but flat and emotionless. "I'm here. I found firewood." Relief flooded through me despite the strangeness of his tone. He was alive. Hurt, perhaps, maybe suffering from exposure or a head injury, but alive. "Mike, come out here," Jennifer said, moving toward the tent. "We need to talk." "I'm coming," the voice replied, but no movement came from inside the tent. Robert grabbed Jennifer's arm, stopping her approach. "Don't," he whispered urgently. "Something's wrong. Listen to his voice." He was right. Michael's voice had always been animated, full of expression and energy. This voice was mechanical, like a recording played back at the wrong speed. "Mike," I called, "we were worried about you. What happened last night?" "I found firewood," the voice repeated, exactly the same inflection as before. "I'm coming." The tent flap opened and Michael emerged. Except it wasn't Michael. Not anymore. The thing that wore Michael's face moved with jerky, unnatural motions like a marionette operated by an inexperienced puppeteer. Its eyes were wrong. Too bright, too aware, like the eyes of a predator studying prey. When it smiled, the expression was too wide, showing too many teeth. "I found firewood," it said again, tilting its head at an angle that would have broken a human neck. We backed away slowly, afraid that sudden movement might trigger an attack. The thing wearing Michael's face watched us with those two bright eyes, maintaining that horrible smile. "Where's Michael?" Jennifer demanded, though I think we all knew the answer. "I'm Michael," the thing replied. "I found firewood. Are you hungry? I found food too." It reached into its pocket and pulled out something red and dripping. In the growing darkness, it took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. A human finger, still wearing Michael's college ring. Jennifer screamed. The thing that wore Michael's face tilted its head the other way, studying our reactions with scientific interest. "Are you hungry?" it repeated. "I found food." We ran. Through the darkness, stumbling over unseen obstacles, crashing through brush that clawed at our clothes and skin. Behind us, that horrible voice called out in Michael's familiar tones, "Where are you going? I found food. I found firewood." We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing in a hollow between two massive boulders. Above us, the stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant. "What was that thing?" Jennifer gasped. Robert was rocking back and forth, his arms wrapped around his knees. "Wendigo," he whispered. "It's a Wendigo." "Wendigos are folklore," I protested weakly. "Native American legends." "Cannibalistic spirits," Robert continued as if he hadn't heard me. "They consume human flesh and take on the appearance of their victims. Always hungry, never satisfied. They hunt in places where the boundaries between worlds grow thin." "You're talking about mythology," Jennifer said, but her voice shook. "Am I?" Robert asked. "Explain what we just saw. Explain the GPS failures, the impossible geography, the camps full of bones. This place isn't on any map because it exists in the spaces between places, where things that shouldn't exist can take root and grow hungry." A sound echoed through the canyon, Michael's voice calling our names. But it came from 3 different directions simultaneously, as if multiple copies of our dead friend were searching for us. "It's hunting us," I realized, using Mike's voice to draw us out. "It's not just hunting us," Robert corrected. "It's playing with us. Wendigos are intelligent. They understand fear, understand how to break people psychologically before consuming them." The voices grew closer, calling our names with increasing urgency. "Guys, where are you? I'm hurt. I need help." Jennifer started to stand, some instinct to help a friend overriding rational fear, but Robert pulled her back down. "It's not him," he hissed. "Mike is gone. That thing is wearing him like a costume." We huddled in our hiding place as the voices circled us. Sometimes Michael's familiar laugh echoed off the canyon walls. Sometimes we heard him singing the stupid camp songs he'd insisted on during the drive north. Once, terrifyingly, we heard him having a conversation with himself, both sides of a dialogue about work and weekend plans and all the mundane details of a life that no longer existed. Dawn found us exhausted and traumatized, but alive. The voices had faded with the darkness, and the canyon seemed empty except for the whisper of wind through stone. "We have to get out of here," Jennifer said unnecessarily. "How?" I asked. "We don't know where we are, our equipment is useless, and that thing is out there somewhere wearing our friend's face." Robert had been studying the canyon walls with the intensity he usually reserved for complex code problems. "The way we came in," he said finally. "We retrace our steps, find that ranch road, get back to civilization." "You think it's that simple?" Jennifer asked. "I think it's our only chance," he replied. We spent the morning cautiously making our way back toward what we hoped was the main valley. Every shadow might hide the thing that had taken Michael. Every sound could be the beginning of another hunt. But the canyon seemed abandoned. No voices called our names. No pale figures watched from rocky ledges. Even the constant whisper of wind had stilled, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. We found the site of our first camp by midday, recognizing the sheltered overhang where we'd spent that first uneasy night. Our abandoned supplies lay scattered exactly where we'd left them in our hasty departure. "From here, we should be able to retrace our route to the truck," I said, consulting the mental map I'd been building over the past 3 days. But when we crested the ridge that should have revealed the valley where we'd started, we found ourselves looking down into an identical canyon. The same red stone walls, the same sparse vegetation, the same sense of oppressive emptiness. "This isn't right," Jennifer said. "We should be looking at the entrance valley." Robert was checking his compass again, tapping it as if physical force could make it behave normally. "According to this, we've been walking east, but the entrance valley is definitely to the west." "The compass is lying," I said. "Just like the GPS. This place doesn't follow normal rules." We tried again, carefully navigating by the sun's position and our best estimate of direction. But every route led to the same result. Identical canyons stretching in all directions, a maze with no exit. By evening, we were forced to accept the horrible truth. We were trapped. Whatever force governed this place, whatever unnatural laws shaped its geography, we were flies caught in a web with no escape. We made camp in another sheltered alcove, building our fire high against the darkness. None of us discussed standing watch. Sleep was impossible anyway. That's when the voices started again. "Guys, I found the way out." Michael's voice, cheerful and normal, echoing from somewhere in the darkness. "Follow my voice. I'll lead you to the truck." We pressed ourselves deeper into our shelter, fighting the urge to respond. The voice continued calling, sometimes from one direction, sometimes from another, always with that same cheerful confidence that had made Michael such an effective salesman. "Come on, guys. Don't be scared. It's just me." Hours passed. The voice never tired, never grew hoarse, never showed any sign of the human limitations that should have silenced it long ago. Toward midnight, the voice changed tactics. Jennifer, I need you to come help me. I'm stuck under some rocks. I can't get free." Jennifer's hands clenched into fists, her whole body trembling with the effort of not responding to a friend in distress. "David, Robert, please, I'm hurt really bad. There's so much blood." The voice grew weak, pained, desperate. Everything human instinct demanded we respond to a friend's suffering. But we held our positions, knowing that compassion would mean death. As dawn approached, the voice grew angry. "Fine," it snarled, no longer bothering to maintain Michael's natural tone. "Stay there and starve. I'll wait. I'm very patient. I've been waiting here for years." The silence that followed was somehow worse than the voices. Day 4 brought a new horror. Our water was running low, and the seasonal creek we'd camped beside had dried to muddy puddles. Without water, we had perhaps another day before dehydration became a serious threat. "There has to be another water source," Jennifer said, but her voice lacked conviction. We spent the morning exploring nearby canyons, searching for any sign of flowing water. What we found instead was evidence of the thing that hunted us. Scratch marks on stone walls, gouged too deep for human fingernails. Footprints in sandy soil that started human but gradually became something else. Elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. And hanging from a dead tree like some macabre scarecrow was Michael's jacket. Inside the jacket's pockets we found his wallet, his keys, and his cell phone. The phone's screen was cracked, but when Robert tried to turn it on, it displayed a message that made our blood freeze. "Hungry" appeared on the screen in large letters. Then, a moment later, "Still hungry." We dropped the phone and ran. By evening, we were down to the last of our water. Dehydration was beginning to affect our judgment, making every decision feel monumental. We were dying slowly, exactly as the Wendigo intended. "It's playing with us," Robert said during our meager dinner of the last energy bars. "It could kill us any time, but it wants us weak first. Helpless." "Why?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Fear seasons the meat," he replied quietly. "That's what the legends say. The more terrified the victim, the better they taste." That night, the Wendigo tried a new approach. Instead of Michael's voice, we heard our own. My voice called from the darkness. "Jennifer, Robert, I found water. Fresh, cold water. Follow my voice." Then Jennifer's voice. "David, you have to see this. I found a radio. We can call for help." Finally, Robert's voice. "Guys, I figured out the pattern. I know how to get out of here." Each voice was perfect, capturing not just the sound but the speech patterns, the personality quirks that made us unique. If I hadn't been sitting next to the real Jennifer and Robert, I might have believed the deception. "How is it doing that?" Jennifer whispered. "It's been watching us," Robert replied, learning us, studying how we think, how we react, what makes us human. So it can replace us, I finished. So it can become us, he corrected. The question is, which one of us will it take next? We didn't have to wait long for the answer. I woke near dawn to find Robert's sleeping bag empty. No sounds of struggle, no cries for help. He'd simply vanished as completely as Michael had. Jennifer and I searched the immediate area, calling his name in hushed whispers. We found his glasses beside the cold ashes of our fire, the lenses cracked as if they'd been stepped on. "It's just us now," Jennifer said unnecessarily. We broke camp without speaking, each of us understanding that staying in one place made us sitting targets. But as we prepared to leave, we heard Robert's voice calling from the canyon depths. "Jennifer, David, I'm down here. I found something amazing." We looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. How long before the Wendigo came for the last of us? How long before I heard Jennifer's voice calling from the darkness, or she heard mine? The day passed in a haze of thirst and mounting paranoia. Every shadow might hide the thing wearing our friends' faces. Every sound could herald the beginning of another hunt. We moved through the maze of canyons like ghosts, afraid to rest, afraid to make noise, afraid to do anything that might draw attention. But the Wendigo was patient. It didn't need to hunt us actively. Dehydration and exposure were doing its work. By evening, we were stumbling rather than walking, our lips cracked and bleeding, our thoughts scattered. "We're going to die here," Jennifer said as we made another fireless camp in the shelter of a boulder field. "Maybe," I agreed, "but we don't have to die as its playthings." I'd been thinking about the legends Robert had shared, trying to remember everything I'd ever read about Wendigos. They were creatures of hunger, but also of winter and desolation. They thrived in isolation, in places where the veil between worlds grew thin. "Fire," I said suddenly. "Traditional weapons don't work against Wendigos, but fire does. It purifies. It breaks the connection between the spirit and the stolen flesh." "We don't have enough fuel for a big fire," Jennifer pointed out. "And what good would it do anyway? We still can't find our way out." But I was remembering something else, a detail from one of the academic papers I'd read during a brief obsession with folklore in college. Wendigos are tied to their hunting grounds. They can't leave the places where they were created. If we can destroy this one, maybe the spell on this place breaks. Maybe the geography goes back to normal. "That's a lot of maybes," Jennifer said. "You have a better plan?" She didn't answer. That night, we heard both Michael's and Robert's voices calling to us from the darkness. They'd found food, they claimed, fresh water, a way out. All we had to do was follow their voices. "What if one of them is real?" Jennifer whispered. "What if Robert escaped somehow, and we're ignoring a genuine call for help?" "Then we'll feel terrible about it," I replied. "But we'll feel terrible and alive." The voices grew more desperate as the night wore on, pleading, cajoling, threatening. Sometimes they spoke to each other, having conversations about us that were clearly meant to be overheard. "They're so stubborn," Michael's voice complained. "Don't they understand we're trying to help them?" "Leave them," Robert's voice replied. "If they want to die of thirst, that's their choice." "But they're our friends," Michael protested. "We can't abandon them." It was a masterful performance, designed to exploit every social instinct we possessed. The need to help friends in distress, the fear of being abandoned, the doubt that perhaps we were wrong about everything. But the voices were too perfect. Real people would be hoarse after hours of calling. Real people would make mistakes, use different words, show some variation in their appeals. These voices were recordings, echoes of our friends' personalities played back by something that understood mimicry but not humanity. Dawn of our 5th day brought a revelation. In our wandering, we'd somehow circled back to the site where we'd found the ancient campsite with its scattered bones. But now, in the early morning light, we could see details we'd missed before. The bones weren't randomly scattered, they formed a pattern, a rough circle with symbols scratched into the rock at regular intervals. And at the center of the circle, a depression in the stone that looked suspiciously like a fire pit. "It's a ritual site," I breathed. "The Wendigo was created here." Jennifer was examining the symbols, her analytical mind working despite our desperate circumstances. "These aren't Native American. They're older, much older." The markings were crude but purposeful, carved deep into the red sandstone. They looked almost familiar, like half-remembered dreams or childhood nightmares given form. "European," I suggested. "Maybe, or something that predates European settlement entirely." We studied the site for over an hour, trying to understand its purpose. The bone circle was approximately 12 feet in diameter. The symbols, if that's what they were, appeared at 6 points around the circumference, and at the very center, the fire pit was stained black with what looked like centuries of use. "Whatever happened here," Jennifer said finally, "it's been happening for a long time." As if summoned by our understanding, the voices started again. But this time they came from all around us simultaneously. Michael and Robert calling our names from every direction at once. "You found it," the voices said in unison. "You found the heart." The temperature plummeted. Our breath misted in air that had been warm moments before. Frost began forming on the rocks despite the desert climate. "You understand now," the voices continued. "This place exists because of the ritual. The sacrifice, the willing gift of flesh and spirit to something old and hungry." A figure materialized at the edge of the bone circle. It wore Michael's face but stood nearly 8 feet tall, its limbs stretched and distorted like a reflection in funhouse mirrors. Behind it came another figure with Robert's features, equally tall and wrong. "We are grateful," they said together. "Grateful for the food you brought, grateful for the fear you seasoned it with. But now the dance must end." They stepped into the circle and I understood with horrible clarity what was going to happen. We would be the next bones scattered around this ancient site. Our remains would join the others who'd been drawn to this place over the decades, perhaps centuries. But Jennifer was already moving. She'd pulled a small bottle from her pack, white gas for her camp stove, and was pouring it over the central fire pit. "The ritual site," she said grimly. "If this is where it started, maybe this is where it can end." The Wendigo things moved toward us with inhuman speed, but Jennifer was already striking a match. The white gas ignited with a whoosh, flames shooting up from the blackened stone. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The creatures that wore our friends' faces screamed in harmony, a sound like winter wind through dead trees. They writhed as if the flames were burning them directly, their stolen shapes beginning to blur and shift. "More fuel," Jennifer shouted. "We need more fuel." I dumped the contents of my pack into the flames, clothing, sleeping bag, anything that would burn. The fire roared higher, and the Wendigo things retreated to the edge of the circle, their forms becoming increasingly unstable. But white gas burns quickly, and soon our improvised pyre was beginning to die down. The creatures sensed the weakness and began advancing again, their shapes solidifying. That's when I remembered the other camps we'd seen from the canyon rim, the scattered gear, the abandoned supplies. There, I pointed to a torn backpack half buried under rockfall. And there. We scrambled to gather fuel from the remains of previous victims, sleeping bags, tents, anything combustible. The Wendigo things followed us, moving with the patience of predators who knew their prey was cornered. But we managed to keep the fire burning. Each time the flames began to weaken, we fed them fresh material. And with each addition, the creatures became more distressed, their stolen forms wavering like heat mirages. Hours passed. The sun climbed toward its zenith, beating down on us without mercy. Our water was long gone, our strength fading, but still we fed the fire. Finally, as the flames consumed the last sleeping bag from some long-dead camper's gear, something fundamental shifted. The Wendigo things let out a final, unified scream and simply dissolved. Their stolen shapes scattered like smoke in the wind, leaving nothing behind but the echo of their cry. The temperature returned to normal. The oppressive silence that had hung over the canyons lifted, and in the distance, incredibly, we heard the sound of a helicopter. The search and rescue team found us 3 hours later, dehydrated and exhausted, but alive. They'd been looking for us since we'd failed to check in with the emergency contact Robert had wisely arranged. "How did you find us?" I asked the lead ranger as they loaded us onto the helicopter. "GPS coordinates from your friend's truck," he replied. "Though I have to say, you folks wandered pretty far from where you parked. According to our maps, you were hiking in the north unit of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, about 15 miles from where your friend said you were planning to camp." I looked at Jennifer. We'd been lost for 5 days in what we'd thought was unmapped wilderness, but we'd actually been in a well-known national park the entire time. The maze of canyons that had seemed so alien was just another part of the Badlands, no different from thousands of other square miles of eroded stone. "What about our friends?" Jennifer asked. "Michael Williams and Robert Johnson. They went missing from our group." The ranger's expression grew grim. "We'll organize a search, but after 5 days in this terrain..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They never found Michael or Robert. The official report listed them as missing persons, presumed dead due to exposure. Their families held memorial services. Their lives became statistics in the National Park Service's annual report on backcountry fatalities. But I know the truth. I know they're still out there in the spaces between worlds, wearing the faces of friends and calling to other lost travelers. Because 3 months later, I got a phone call in the middle of the night. "David," Michael's voice clear as day. "We found the way out. We're coming home." I hung up immediately and changed my phone number the next day. Jennifer moved to Portland 2 weeks after we returned. She sent me a text message. "Heard Mike's voice on my voicemail. We can't let anyone else go through what we did." She was right, but what could we do? Report that a cannibalistic spirit was hunting in Theodore Roosevelt National Park? Warn people about an ancient ritual site that probably looked like just another pile of rocks to anyone who hadn't seen what we'd seen? In the end, we did nothing. Because who would believe us? But sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I think about that place, about the bones scattered in their ritual circle, about the countless missing persons reports filed every year for people who vanish in remote wilderness areas. And I wonder how many of them found their way to places where the boundaries grow thin, where old hungers wake and hunt with the faces of friends. If you're planning a camping trip to the Badlands, to any remote wilderness area, remember this. If your GPS stops working, if your compasses start lying, if the geography seems wrong somehow, turn around, get out. Don't trust voices calling from the darkness, no matter how familiar they sound, because some places are hungry, and they're always looking for new faces to wear. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote Badlands of North Dakota, 20 miles south of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, in a place where the wind never stops howling and the darkness swallows sound itself. David Jones had been my best friend since we were 7 years old, building forts in the woods behind our houses in Bismarck. Now, at 30, he was newly divorced and desperately needed to get away from the wreckage of his marriage. When he suggested a camping trip to the Little Missouri Badlands, just the two of us like old times, I couldn't say no. I should have. We drove his rusted Ford pickup down Highway 85 on a gray October morning, the landscape growing more desolate with each mile. The Badlands stretched endlessly in all directions, twisted formations of red and gray rock carved by wind and water into alien spires and deep coulees. David had found a spot on his hunting maps, a remote canyon called Devil's Backbone, where we could camp undisturbed for a long weekend. "Remember when we used to camp in my backyard?" David asked, his voice hollow. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his usually neat brown hair hung limp and unwashed. The divorce had destroyed him. We'd tell ghost stories until we scared ourselves stupid. Yeah, I said, watching the endless badlands roll past. Except now we're adults who should know better. David laughed, but it sounded forced. Sometimes I wish I was 8 years old again. Everything was so much simpler then. The gravel road to Devil's Backbone was barely visible, more of a suggestion than an actual trail. We bounced and rattled for another hour, the truck's suspension groaning with each pothole. Finally, the road simply ended at the edge of a deep coulee, its walls striped with layers of ancient sediment. "This is it," David said, consulting his map. "We hike down from here." I shouldered my pack and followed him down a narrow deer trail into the canyon. The walls rose 60 feet on either side, blocking out most of the already weak autumn sun. The air grew noticeably colder as we descended, and I pulled my jacket tighter. My father had died in a mine collapse when I was 12, crushed in a space not much bigger than this canyon, and being surrounded by rock walls always made my chest tighten with old panic. The bottom of the coulee was maybe 30 feet wide, carpeted with buffalo grass and scattered with bleached bones from long-dead cattle. David found a relatively flat spot near a cluster of stunted cottonwood trees and started setting up his tent. "Perfect," he said, spreading his arms wide. "Not another soul for miles. Just us and the wilderness." I tried to share his enthusiasm, but something felt wrong about this place. The silence was too complete. No bird songs, no insect buzz, not even the rustle of small animals in the grass. The only sound was the constant moan of wind through the rock formations above us, a low, keening note that seemed to resonate in my bones. As I set up my own tent, I noticed dark stains on some of the rocks near our campsite. They looked like old blood, though they could have been anything. Iron deposits, maybe, or just discoloration from water runoff. Still, they made me uneasy. David seemed not to notice. He was already gathering deadfall for a fire, humming tunelessly to himself. For the first time since his wife left him, he looked almost happy. That should have been a good thing. We spent the afternoon hiking deeper into the badlands, following game trails through narrow passages between towering rock formations. David had brought his GPS unit, but it kept losing signal, the screen flickering between conflicting readings. The device claimed we were sometimes moving backward even when we walked steadily forward, or that we'd gained 300 feet of elevation when the terrain was clearly flat. "Stupid thing's busted," David muttered, shaking the GPS. "Good thing I brought the paper maps." But when he unfolded his topographical map, we couldn't find any of the landmarks we'd been seeing. The rock formations didn't match the contour lines, and a dry stream bed that should have been running north-south according to the map was clearly flowing east-west. "Maybe we took a wrong turn somewhere," I said, though I was certain we'd followed the main trail. David studied the map with growing frustration. "This doesn't make sense. It's like the whole landscape shifted." He looked up at me, and for a moment his expression was completely lost, almost childlike. "We're not really lost, are we, Mike?" "Nah," I lied. "We just head back the way we came. No problem." But when we turned around, the trail we'd been following was gone. Where clear footprints in the sandy soil should have marked our passage, there was only undisturbed earth and clumps of buffalo grass. Even our boot prints seemed to vanish after about 20 yards, as if the land itself was erasing our presence. The sun was already sinking toward the western rim of the badlands, painting the rocks the color of dried blood. In the growing shadows, the rock formations looked less like natural sculptures and more like crouching figures watching us from the darkness. "We need to get back," I said, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "It's getting dark." David nodded, but his movements seemed oddly slow, as if he was fighting through thick water. When he spoke, his voice sounded distant. "The dark comes so fast out here, like it's alive." Somehow, I still can't explain how, we found our way back to camp just as the last light died. Our fire ring was exactly where we'd left it, but the wood David had carefully stacked beside it was gone. In its place was a single charred log that definitely hadn't been there before, still warm to the touch, though no fire had been burning. "That's weird," David said, poking at the log with his boot. "Maybe the wind scattered the wood." But there was no wind in the bottom of the coulee. The air hung perfectly still, pregnant with an expectant silence that made my skin crawl. We gathered more deadfall by flashlight, though it was difficult to find dry wood. Everything felt damp and somehow wrong, as if it had been rotting from the inside. When we finally got a fire started, the flames burned an odd greenish color and gave off a smell like spoiled meat. "You ever hear any stories about this place?" I asked, settling onto a flat rock across from David. The firelight threw dancing shadows on the canyon walls, making them seem to shift and move. David was staring into the flames with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Stories. Local legends, ghost stories. You know." He was quiet for so long I thought he hadn't heard me. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The Lakota called this whole area Wakan, sacred, but also dangerous. They said some places hold old hunger, old rage, said there are things that live in the deep places, things that used to be human but aren't anymore." "You're making that up." "Am I?" David looked up at me, and his eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "What if some places are just wrong? Mike? What if the land itself can be poisoned?" The fire popped and hissed, sending up a shower of green sparks. One landed on my hand, but instead of the expected burn, it felt ice cold. I brushed it away with a shudder. "You're freaking me out, man." David smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry, divorce makes you think weird thoughts. About what's real and what isn't. About whether the person you wake up next to every morning is really the same person you went to sleep with." We sat in silence after that, each lost in our own thoughts. The fire gradually burned down to embers and the darkness pressed closer. I checked my watch, 11:43 p.m., but I could have sworn we'd just finished dinner an hour ago. "I'm going to turn in," I said, standing and stretching. My joints ached like I'd been sitting for hours. "Yeah, me too." David kicked dirt over the coals, but instead of dying, they seemed to glow brighter, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. "Sweet dreams, Mike." I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, grateful for even the thin nylon barrier between me and the oppressive darkness outside. Through the tent walls, I could hear David moving around his campsite, but the sounds seemed off somehow. Too heavy, like he was dragging his feet, and punctuated by odd pauses. Sleep came eventually, but it was restless and full of dreams. I dreamed of being buried alive, tons of rock crushing down on me while I screamed for my father. I dreamed of David's ex-wife, Sarah, her face twisted with rage as she threw dishes and screamed about betrayal. And I dreamed of something vast and hungry moving through the badlands, drawn by the scent of human despair. I woke to absolute silence. The absence of sound was so complete it felt like a physical presence pressing against my eardrums. No wind, no settling rocks, no night sounds at all. Even my own breathing seemed muffled and distant. I checked my watch with a penlight. 3:17 a.m. David's tent was a dark bulk maybe 15 feet away, but I couldn't hear him breathing or moving. The silence stretched on, unbroken and unnatural. Then I heard it, a soft, scratching sound, like fingernails on fabric. It seemed to be coming from just outside my tent, circling slowly around the perimeter. Scratch. 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 Each sound precisely timed, methodical. "David?" I whispered, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive quiet. The scratching stopped. I lay perfectly still, every muscle tensed, waiting for the sound to resume. Minutes passed. My legs started to cramp from holding the same position, but I didn't dare move. The darkness beyond my tent walls felt alive, watching. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent flap and look outside, there was nothing there. David's tent stood undisturbed, and the dead coals of our fire gave off no light at all. But in the sandy soil around my tent, clearly visible in the beam of my flashlight, were scratches in the earth, long gouges that could have been made by claws or fingernails. They formed a perfect circle around where I'd been sleeping. I wanted to wake David, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way his tent seemed too still, too quiet. Maybe it was the growing certainty that if I called his name, something else might answer. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to the silence and watching the tent walls for moving shadows. Dawn came slowly, the canyon walls blocking the sun until nearly 8 a.m. When light finally reached the bottom of the coulee, I emerged from my tent feeling hollow and exhausted. David's tent was still zipped shut. "Dave?" I called softly. "You awake?" No response. I walked over and tapped on the tent fabric. "David, we should get moving if we want to." The tent was empty. Not just empty, it looked like it had been empty all night. David's sleeping bag was laid out neatly, but it hadn't been slept in. His backpack was gone, along with most of his gear. Only his spare clothes remained, folded in a precise stack that David would never have bothered with. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I called his name, loud enough to echo off the canyon walls, but got no response except my own voice bouncing back, distorted and strange. I found his tracks leading away from camp, heading deeper into the badlands through a narrow cleft in the rock I hadn't noticed the day before. The footprints were definitely David's. I recognized the distinctive tread pattern of his hiking boots, but they seemed oddly spaced, as if he'd been taking unnaturally long strides. I followed the trail through increasingly narrow passages between towering rock formations. The walls pressed closer together with each turn until I had to squeeze sideways in places. My claustrophobia clawed at me, making my chest tight and my breathing shallow, but I forced myself to keep going. David needed help. The passage opened suddenly into a circular chamber maybe 50 feet across, surrounded by sheer rock walls that climbed toward a circle of gray sky. In the center of the chamber was a pile of white objects that resolved into bones as I got closer. Not just animal bones, but human remains mixed in with deer and cattle skeletons. Some looked ancient, bleached white by decades of weather, but others were fresher, still bearing scraps of flesh and clothing. David stood at the far side of the bone pile, his back to me. "Jesus, Dave!" I called out, relief flooding through me. I was worried sick. "What are you doing out here?" He didn't turn around, didn't even acknowledge that he'd heard me. I picked my way carefully around the edge of the bone pile, noting with growing unease that many of the human skulls showed signs of violence. Cracked bones, missing jaws, holes that could only have been made by something feeding. As I got closer to David, I could see that he was perfectly still, standing like a statue with his arms hanging loose at his sides. "David." I reached out to touch his shoulder and he finally turned around. It was David's face, but wrong in ways that made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing. His skin had a grayish pallor, like old meat, and his eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible eye. When he smiled, his teeth looked too sharp, filed to points, and his mouth stretched wider than human anatomy should allow. "Hello, Mike," he said in David's voice, but the words came out wrong, too slow, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "I've been waiting for you." I stumbled backward, my rational mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. "David, what happened to you? Are you hurt?" That impossible smile stretched even wider. David went away, but I like his shape. I like his memories. I know all about you, Mike. About your father dying in the dark. About how small spaces make you want to scream. You're not David. The words came out as a whisper. No. The thing wearing my friend's face agreed, but he made it so easy. All that pain, all that anger about his failed marriage, all that self-hatred. I just had to reach inside and twist a little, and he welcomed me in. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like water. The thing that had been David took a step closer, and I could smell rot on its breath, the stench of decay and old death. "He's still in here, you know," it said, tapping David's temple with one finger. "Screaming and screaming and screaming. Would you like to hear?" For just a moment, David's eyes flickered back to normal, full of terror and desperate pleading. His mouth opened and a sound came out that no human throat should be able to make, a keening wail of pure anguish that echoed off the chamber walls like the cry of a damned soul. Then the thing was back in control, those black eyes fixed on me with predatory hunger. "I've been so lonely," it said, "so hungry. It's been decades since someone wandered into my domain. The Dakota knew to avoid this place, but you white men never listen to warnings, do you?" I finally found my voice. "What do you want?" "Want?" It laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I want to feel human again, to remember what it was like to have hope, to have love, to have dreams. But first I have to empty you out, piece by piece. The pain is the best part. It makes the meat so much sweeter." The thing wearing David's face lunged at me with inhuman speed. I threw myself sideways, rolling behind the pile of bones. Fingers that were too long and ended in black claws raked across my back, shredding my jacket and leaving burning lines of pain. I scrambled toward the narrow passage I'd come through, but it was gone. Where the opening should have been, there was only solid rock. The chamber had somehow sealed itself, trapping me with this nightmare creature that used to be my best friend. "There's no escape," it said, circling around the bone pile with predatory grace. "This is my place, my domain. The rules of your world don't apply here." I grabbed a femur from the pile and swung it like a club, catching the thing across the side of its head. The bone connected with a wet crack, and David's body staggered sideways. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Then it straightened up, and I saw that the skull was caved in on one side, leaking a black ichor that wasn't blood. The thing smiled that too wide smile and reached up to push the broken bone back into place with a sound like grinding gravel. "That hurt," it said conversationally. "I like pain. It reminds me that I still exist." This time, when it came at me, I was ready. I ducked low and swept its legs, sending it crashing into the bone pile. Skulls scattered and rib cages collapsed as David's body hit the ground. I didn't wait to see if it would get up. I ran for the chamber walls, looking for any crack or fissure that might lead to freedom. The rock was solid basalt, unmarked by any opening. I was trapped in this circular hell with a creature that wore my friend's face and hungered for my suffering. Behind me, I heard the thing getting to its feet, bones clattering as it pushed itself up from the pile of remains. When I turned around, it was brushing dust from David's clothes with casual, almost human gestures. "I remember when David first saw Sarah," it said conversationally. "He was 19, working his first summer job at a restaurant in Fargo. She came in with friends, laughing at something one of them had said, and he thought she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He spent 3 weeks working up the courage to ask her out. Stop it. They were happy for a while. Really happy. David used to lie awake at night just listening to her breathe, amazed that someone like her could love someone like him. But then the fighting started. Little things at first. She didn't like his friends, he worked too much. She wanted kids and he wasn't ready. The love curdled into resentment. The thing's black eyes seemed to drink in my horror. The worst part was that they both knew it was over long before either admitted it. They just kept hurting each other over and over because they didn't know how to stop. When she finally left, David felt relieved, and then he hated himself for feeling relieved. "David, if you can hear me." "Oh, he can hear you," the creature said. "Every word. Want to know what he's thinking right now?" It cocked its head like it was listening to some internal voice. "He's remembering the time you fell through the ice on the Missouri River when you were kids. How he pulled you out, both of you shivering and scared but alive. He's wishing he could save you now, but he can't even save himself." The thing took another step closer, and I backed against the chamber wall. The rock felt ice cold against my spine, and I realized with growing panic that my breath was now visible in the air. The temperature was dropping fast, far faster than was natural. "Cold feeds me," the creature explained as if reading my thoughts. "Fear feeds me, despair feeds me, and pain." It smiled that horrible smile. "Pain is dessert." Its hand shot out faster than I could react, fingers wrapping around my throat with crushing force. It lifted me off the ground effortlessly, David's muscles moving with strength no human body should possess. My vision started to darken around the edges as my air supply was cut off. "I could kill you quickly," it whispered, its face inches from mine. I could see my reflection in those solid black eyes, distorted and terrified. "But where's the fun in that? I think I'll start with your fingers. Did you know you can keep someone conscious for quite a while if you're careful about blood loss?" Spots danced in my vision, but through the growing darkness I caught sight of something that made my heart leap. David's hunting knife was still clipped to his belt, the handle within reach if I could just... My fingers closed around the knife's grip and I yanked it free, driving the blade deep into the thing's wrist. It shrieked, a sound like grinding metal, and released its grip on my throat. I dropped to the ground, gasping and choking, as the creature staggered backward with the knife still embedded in its arm. Black ichor poured from the wound, but instead of weakening the thing, the injury seemed to energize it. It grabbed the knife handle and pulled the blade free with a wet sucking sound, then held it up to examine the sticky black substance coating the steel. "Iron," it said with what sounded like approval. "I haven't tasted iron in so long. Thank you for the gift." It raised the knife above its head, and I knew I had seconds before it came down. In desperation, I grabbed a jagged piece of stone from the bone pile and hurled it at David's face. The rock caught the creature in the left eye with a wet pop, and it stumbled backward with a howl of rage. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, David's face returned to normal. The black eye faded back to brown, and his expression was his own again, full of pain and horror and desperate love. "Run! Mike!" he gasped, blood streaming down his cheek from the ruined eye. "It's weak when it's hurt. The passage. Look for the..." Then the thing was back in control, and David's face twisted into a mask of inhuman fury. But I'd seen what I needed to see. Where there had been solid rock before, a narrow crack had appeared in the chamber wall, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was there. I lunged for the opening as the creature came after me, its claws raking across my back and leaving deep gouges. The passage was even narrower than the one I'd followed to reach the chamber, so tight that I had to exhale completely just to squeeze through. My claustrophobia screamed at me to turn back, but behind me, I could hear the thing trying to force David's body through the crack, snarling with frustrated rage. The passage seemed to go on forever, a nightmare corridor of stone that pressed against me from all sides. Several times I got stuck and had to work myself free, scraping skin from my arms and chest. But I kept moving, driven by the sounds of pursuit behind me, scraping and scratching as the creature tried to follow. Finally, after what felt like hours, I squeezed through one last constriction and tumbled out onto familiar ground. I was back at our campsite, though I had no memory of any passage connecting it to the bone chamber. Our tents stood exactly where we'd left them, and morning sunlight slanted down into the coulee. But something was wrong with the light. It had a strange quality, like looking through colored glass, and when I checked my watch it read 6:43 a.m., 3 hours earlier than when I'd entered the passage. I didn't stop to think about the impossibility of it. I just grabbed my pack and started climbing out of the coulee using handholds and ledges I definitely hadn't noticed on the way down. Behind me, I could hear something coming through the passage, a wet, sliding sound punctuated by snarls of rage. I reached the rim just as the thing wearing David's face emerged from a crack in the rock that hadn't been there the day before. It looked up at me with its remaining eye, and I saw that the ruined socket was already healing, new tissue growing with unnatural speed. "You can't escape me, Mike," it called up. "I know where you live, I know where you work, I know everyone you care about. David's memories are mine now, and I'll use them to find you." I ran for David's truck, keys clutched in my shaking hand. The engine turned over on the third try, and I floored the accelerator, gravel spraying as I fought to get traction. In the rearview mirror, I could see the thing climbing out of the coulee with inhuman speed, moving up the rock face like a spider. The gravel road had never seemed so long. Every time I checked the mirror, the thing was closer, running with a loping gait that covered ground impossibly fast. David's face was a mask of black blood and rage, but it still looked enough like my friend to make my heart break. I reached the highway just as the creature emerged from the badlands behind me. It stood at the edge of the gravel road, watching me drive away, and I swear I could feel its gaze like ice between my shoulder blades. That was 3 weeks ago. I've been staying in a motel in Billings ever since, afraid to go home, afraid to contact anyone who might lead that thing to them. I've thought about going to the police, but what would I tell them? That my best friend was possessed by some ancient evil in the North Dakota badlands? They'd lock me up or put me on medication. But I can't keep running forever. And lately, I've been having dreams. Dreams where David visits me in the middle of the night looking perfectly normal except for his eyes. In the dreams, he tells me that he forgives me for leaving him behind. He says he understands why I had to save myself. The dreams feel so real. Last night, I woke up to find my motel room door standing open. I know I locked it before going to bed. I always lock it now. But there it was, hanging wide open to the Montana darkness. On the table next to my bed was something that made my blood freeze. David's GPS unit, the one that had been glitching in the Badlands. I picked it up with trembling hands and turned it on. The screen showed my current location with perfect accuracy. But there was a second blip on the display, moving slowly but steadily toward the motel. The label read, David Jones. I'm writing this now because I don't think I'm going to make it much longer. Whatever that thing is, it's found me, and it's coming. I can hear footsteps in the hallway outside my room, slow and deliberate, stopping at each door. There's a knock at my door now. Soft, polite, the same way David always knocked when he came to pick me up for our camping trips. Mike? The voice is perfectly normal, perfectly David. I know you're in there, buddy. We need to talk. I'm not going to answer. I'm going to sit here and... The doorknob is turning. I locked that door. I know I locked it, but the knob is turning anyway, slow and steady, and I can see a shadow moving under the gap at the bottom of the door. I missed you, Mike, David's voice says from the other side. I've been so lonely without my best friend. But don't worry, we're going to be together forever now, just like we always promised when we were kids. The door is opening. I can see David standing in the hallway, and he looks completely normal except for his smile. That terrible, too wide smile that stretches across his face like an open wound. Hello, Mike, he says. I'm home. I'm going to try to run. My name is Robert Johnson, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Little Missouri National Grassland, about 15 miles southwest of the Scoria Pit Dispersed Camping Area in western North Dakota, during the second week of October 2024. I'd convinced 3 of my closest friends to join me for what I promised would be an unforgettable weekend camping trip. Michael Williams, my college roommate and perpetual optimist, had been eager to escape his cubicle life in Bismarck. Jennifer Williams, Michael's younger sister and a photography enthusiast from Fargo, wanted to capture the Badlands' autumn colors. Sarah Rodriguez, a nurse from Grand Forks who'd recently gone through a messy divorce, needed the distraction more than any of us. The plan was simple. Drive out Friday evening, set up camp in the remote grasslands, spend Saturday hiking and exploring, then head home Sunday. I'd researched the area extensively, choosing a spot far from the designated camping areas where we could truly disconnect. No cell service, no other campers, just us and the vast North Dakota wilderness. The drive west on Highway 85 had been uneventful. the conversation flowing as easily as the beer Michael had brought along. Jennifer snapped photos through the passenger window while Sarah dozed in the back seat, exhausted from back-to-back shifts at the hospital. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the Badlands in shades of amber and rust, I felt that familiar thrill of anticipation. This was exactly what we all needed. I turned off the main road onto a barely visible dirt track that wound deeper into the grassland. The GPS on my phone had lost signal about 20 minutes earlier, but I'd studied the topographical maps enough to navigate by landmarks. A distinctive butte, shaped like a broken tooth, marked our turnoff, and from there it was maybe 3 miles to the secluded clearing I'd identified on satellite images. "Jesus, Rob, are you sure this is still a road?" Michael asked as the truck bounced through another series of ruts. Dust billowed behind us in the rearview mirror, the only sign of human passage in this desolate landscape. "It's an old cattle track," I assured him, though privately I was beginning to wonder if I'd taken a wrong turn. The terrain looked different than I'd expected. More eroded, more hostile. Twisted junipers dotted the rolling hills like arthritic fingers, and deep ravines cut through the earth like wounds. "Should be just ahead." But it wasn't. We drove for another 40 minutes as the sun disappeared and darkness swallowed the Badlands whole. My headlights carved weak tunnels through the black, illuminating nothing but more dirt tracks stretching endlessly forward. The gas gauge was approaching a quarter tank. "Rob," Sarah's voice carried a note of concern, "where exactly are we?" I pulled out my phone again, hoping for a miracle. No signal, and worse, the GPS app was showing our location as a blank gray void. Even the offline maps I'd downloaded seemed to have corrupted. The screen displayed nothing but empty pixels where North Dakota should have been. "Don't worry," I said, forcing confidence into my voice. "We'll just backtrack to the highway and camp at one of the designated sites." But when I tried to turn around, the track had somehow narrowed. Steep embankments rose on both sides, and I couldn't find anywhere wide enough to execute a 3-point turn. The logical part of my brain insisted this was impossible. We'd driven down this same route just minutes earlier. But the evidence of my eyes was undeniable. "This is fucking weird," Michael muttered, peering out his window into the darkness. "I swear these hills weren't here before." I kept driving forward, searching for a place to turn around, telling myself that everything would make sense in daylight. But the track just kept going, winding deeper into terrain that seemed to shift and change in my peripheral vision. Rock formations loomed like sleeping giants, and the wind carried sounds that might have been voices or might have been something else entirely. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the track opened into a circular clearing perhaps 50 yards across. Tall grass swayed in the breeze, and ancient cottonwoods formed a natural windbreak along one side. It was exactly the kind of secluded campsite I'd been looking for, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd arrived here by accident rather than design. "Well," Jennifer said, her voice carefully neutral, "at least it's pretty." We set up camp quickly, eager to get the tents erected before the temperature dropped too much further. October nights in North Dakota could be brutal, and the wind was already picking up. I'd brought a 3-season tent rated for temperatures down to 20 degrees, while the others had less robust equipment. We arranged the tents in a rough circle around where we planned to build our fire. But when Michael tried to light the kindling, the flames wouldn't catch. The wood was dry. I checked it myself, but every match or lighter flame would flicker and die the moment it touched the tinder. Even the chemical fire starters I'd brought as backup refused to ignite properly. "Must be the wind," Sarah suggested, though the air had actually grown still since we'd stopped driving. After 40 minutes of increasingly frustrated attempts, we finally got a small fire going, though it burned with an odd blue-green tinge that none of us commented on. We heated canned soup over my camping stove and passed around a bottle of whiskey Michael had brought, trying to recapture the easy camaraderie of the drive. But something felt off. The darkness beyond our fire seemed too dense, too absolute. When I shined my flashlight into the surrounding trees, The beam seemed to stop abruptly, as if the light itself was being absorbed. And the silence was wrong. No cricket sounds, no rustling of small animals, nothing but the occasional moan of wind through the cottonwoods. "Did anyone else notice how we haven't seen any wildlife?" Jennifer asked, voicing what we were all thinking. "No birds, no deer, nothing." "It's just the season," I said. "Migration patterns and all that." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they rang false. We should have seen something. Mice, rabbits, insects. This level of emptiness felt unnatural, ominous. We turned in around 10 o'clock, exhaustion finally overcoming our vague unease. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the wind and trying to convince myself that everything would seem normal in the morning. The GPS would work, we'd find our way back to the highway, and this would just become another camping story to laugh about over drinks. I was wrong. I woke to the sound of Jennifer screaming. Pale dawn light filtered through my tent walls, and for a moment I was disoriented, unsure where I was or why my heart was hammering so frantically. Then Jennifer screamed again, a raw sound of terror that cut through the morning air like a blade. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped my tent flap. Jennifer stood in the center of our camp circle, still in her pajamas, pointing at something with a shaking hand. I followed her gaze and felt my blood turn to ice water. Sarah's tent was empty. Not just empty. The sleeping bag had been unzipped from the inside, methodically and carefully as if she'd gotten up to use the bathroom, but her hiking boots were still arranged neatly by the tent entrance, and her jacket hung from a tree branch where she'd left it the night before. "She's gone," Jennifer whispered. "Sarah's gone." Michael emerged from his tent, hair sticking up at odd angles, squinting in the morning light. "What's going on? Where's Sarah?" We searched the campsite thoroughly, calling her name until our voices went hoarse. There was no sign of struggle, no footprints leading away from camp, no indication of what might have happened. Her personal belongings were all accounted for. Wallet, keys, even her phone, though like ours it showed no signal. "Maybe she went for a walk," Michael suggested weakly. "You know how she likes her morning alone time." But Sarah was practical to a fault, a trauma nurse who'd seen enough emergencies to never take unnecessary risks. She wouldn't have wandered off into unfamiliar terrain in the dark without boots or a flashlight. We expanded our search, venturing out from camp in widening circles. The landscape in daylight was even more unsettling than it had been the night before. Twisted formations of red stone jutted from the earth like broken bones, and deep ravines carved the terrain into a maze of dead ends and false paths. The grass was brown and brittle despite the early hour, as if all moisture had been leached from it. "Sarah!" I called until my throat was raw. "Sarah!" Only echoes answered, bouncing off the stone formations with a hollow, mocking quality. We searched for 3 hours before admitting defeat. Michael suggested we hike back to the main road to get help, but when we tried to retrace our route from the night before, we couldn't find the dirt track. It was as if it had simply vanished, leaving no trace of how we'd arrived at this place. "This is impossible," Jennifer said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Roads don't just disappear." I tried my phone again, hoping desperately for even a single bar of service. Nothing. The GPS still showed that same blank gray void, and now even the time display seemed to be malfunctioning, jumping erratically between different hours. We returned to camp as the sun reached its zenith, dejected and increasingly frightened. Without Sarah, without any way to communicate with the outside world, we were stranded in a landscape that seemed actively hostile to our presence. "We'll wait here," I decided. "When we don't show up on Sunday, people will come looking for us." But even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. I'd been deliberately vague about our exact destination, wanting to preserve the sense of adventure. My parents thought I was car camping near Medora. Michael's girlfriend knew he was going to North Dakota but had no specific details. Would anyone even know where to start looking? That afternoon, as we sat around the cold remains of our fire pit, Sarah walked back into camp. She emerged from the tree line to the east, moving with her characteristic purposeful stride, still wearing the same clothes she'd had on when she disappeared. For a moment, relief flooded through me so powerfully that my knees went weak. "Sarah?" Jennifer leaped up and ran toward her. "Thank God! Where were you? We've been looking everywhere." But something in Sarah's posture made me hesitate. She stood perfectly still at the edge of the clearing, hands at her sides, staring at us with an expression I couldn't quite read. Her face was pale, almost gray, and there were dark circles under her eyes as if she hadn't slept in days. "Sarah." Michael's voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Are you okay?" She turned toward him, and I saw her smile. But it was wrong somehow. Too wide, lasting too long, never quite reaching her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded like Sarah's but pitched slightly higher, as if someone were doing an imperfect impression. "I'm fine," she said. "I went for a walk. Got a little lost." "Lost for 12 hours?" Jennifer stepped closer, studying Sarah's face with growing concern. "Sarah, you've been gone since last night. We were terrified." Sarah blinked slowly, deliberately, like a lizard processing information. 12 hours? No, that's not right. I was only gone for a few minutes." She walked past us toward her tent, moving with an odd, mechanical gait that reminded me unnervingly of a marionette. When she bent to pick up her boots, the motion was too precise, too controlled, as if she was concentrating on each individual muscle movement. "Sarah." I kept my voice gentle but firm. "What do you remember about last night, after we went to sleep?" She straightened and turned to face me, that unsettling smile still plastered across her features. For just a moment, I could have sworn her pupils were dilated to the point where her eyes looked completely black. "I remember everything," she said. "I remember the fire that wouldn't light properly. I remember how quiet it was, how empty. I remember the dreams." "What dreams?" "I dreamed about the water." She tilted her head at an angle that was just slightly too far to be natural. "I dreamed about something in the water, something that's been waiting for so long, something red and ancient that remembers when this land was covered by an inland sea." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. "Sarah, you're scaring me." "Am I?" Her smile widened further, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "I don't mean to be scary, Rob. I'm just Sarah. Good old reliable Sarah." But she wasn't. Every instinct I possessed was screaming that whatever had walked back into our camp wearing Sarah's face was not my friend. The way she moved, the way she spoke, even the way she breathed. Everything was subtly, horribly wrong. Jennifer must have sensed it too. She backed away slowly, her hand reaching for her camera bag where she kept a can of pepper spray. "Maybe we should head back," Jennifer suggested carefully. "It's been a long day, and we're all pretty shaken up." "Oh, but we can't leave yet," Sarah said, her voice taking on a sing-song quality. "We haven't met the Mini-Washatu yet." The word hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard it before, years ago, during a graduate research project on Northern Plains folklore. A creature from Arikara and Mandan legend. A water monster with red hair and a single eye that lived in the Missouri River. According to the stories, anyone who saw it would go insane and die. "How do you know that word?" I whispered. Sarah's head swiveled toward me with the fluid motion of a snake tracking prey. "It told me. Down in the cold, dark water where the old bones rest. It's been so lonely, Rob. So hungry. It remembers when the great herds came to drink, when the tribes would sing to it from the banks. But now the river is tamed, caged behind dams and concrete. So it had to come here, to the place where water once was, to the place where water will be again." "You're talking nonsense," Michael said, but his voice shook. "Sarah, you need help. You need to see a doctor." She laughed, a sound like glass breaking in the distance. "Poor Michael. You never did believe in anything you couldn't see or touch." but some things are older than your beliefs. Some things remember." As if responding to her words, the wind picked up, rustling the dry grass with a sound like whispered secrets. The temperature began to drop with unnatural speed, and I realized that the sun, which had been shining brightly just minutes before, was now obscured by clouds that seemed to have materialized from nothing. "We're leaving," I announced, standing up and moving toward my tent. "Right now. Pack everything." "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Sarah said pleasantly. "It gets confused when people try to leave. Angry. The last group that tried to run." She paused, tilting her head as if listening to something only she could hear. "Well, it's been so long since it had fresh meat." That was enough for Jennifer. She lunged for her camera bag, fingers scrambling for the pepper spray. But Sarah moved faster than any human should have been able to, crossing the 10 feet between them in what seemed like a single fluid motion. Her hand closed around Jennifer's wrist with a wet, squelching sound, and I saw with horror that her fingers had elongated into something resembling talons. Jennifer screamed and tried to pull away, but Sarah's grip was implacable. Dark bruises were already forming where those not-quite-human fingers pressed into flesh. "Don't be rude," Sarah said in that horrible, cheerful voice. "It's waited so long for company. The least you can do is stay for dinner." I grabbed a thick branch from our woodpile and swung it at Sarah's head with all my strength. The impact should have knocked her unconscious, possibly killed her. Instead, the branch splintered against her skull with no more effect than if I'd struck stone. She turned to look at me, still smiling, blood trickling from a scalp wound that sealed itself even as I watched. "That wasn't very nice, Rob." She released Jennifer, who collapsed to the ground, clutching her wrist. But instead of pursuing either of us, Sarah simply walked to the center of our camp and sat down cross-legged in the dirt. She closed her eyes and began to hum, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The ground beneath our feet began to shift and buckle as if something massive was moving underneath it. The cottonwoods groaned and swayed despite the absence of wind, their branches reaching toward us with grasping motion. And from somewhere far below, I heard the sound of rushing water. "It's coming up," Sarah announced without opening her eyes. "The old water, the deep water. It remembers this place when it was a sea floor, when great creatures swam where we now walk. It's bringing some of them with it." Cracks appeared in the earth around our campsite, spreading outward like a spider web. Dark liquid began to seep through. Not water, but something thicker, more viscous, that smelled of rotting vegetation and ancient decay. As I watched in paralyzed horror, the liquid formed pools that reflected no light, as if they were windows into infinite depth. Something moved in one of the pools, a flash of red, a glimpse of scales or wet fur, gone too quickly to properly identify, but the image burned itself into my mind. A single, massive eye, yellow as old bone, staring up at me with predatory intelligence. "We have to run," I gasped, grabbing Jennifer's arm and hauling her to her feet. "Now!" We fled toward the tree line, crashing through underbrush that hadn't been there the day before, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. Behind us, Sarah's humming grew louder, more insistent, joined by other sounds. Splashing, clicking, the wet slide of something large moving through liquid. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The dark pools had expanded and merged, creating what looked like a small lake in the center of our campsite. Things moved beneath its surface, shapes too large and wrong to belong to any creature I could name. And standing knee-deep in the dark water, still humming, was Sarah. But not Sarah. Whatever wore her form had changed, become something fluid and shifting. Her skin rippled like disturbed water, and her hair moved independently of any breeze, floating around her head as if she were submerged. When she opened her eyes, they reflected the pale morning light like a nocturnal animal's. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, collapsing finally behind a formation of red stone that offered some concealment. Jennifer was sobbing quietly, cradling her injured wrist against her chest. Michael had gone completely white, staring back toward our camp with the expression of a man whose worldview had just shattered beyond repair. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. "What happened to Sarah?" I didn't have an answer. Nothing in my experience, nothing in any rational understanding of the world, could explain what we'd just witnessed. But the folklore came flooding back. Stories of water spirits that could steal human forms, of ancient creatures that dwelt in the deep places and emerged only to hunt. "We need to keep moving," I said. "Get as far away from here as possible." "And go where?" Jennifer's voice was raw from crying. "We don't even know where we are. Our phones don't work, our GPS is useless, and the road we came in on has vanished. Face it, Rob, we're trapped here." She was right, but I couldn't accept it. There had to be a rational explanation, a logical way out of this nightmare. I stood up and surveyed the landscape, looking for anything that might serve as a landmark or navigation aid. That's when I saw the lights. They appeared first as pale flickers in the distance, dancing through the air like oversized fireflies. Will-o'-the-wisps, my grandmother might have called them, though she'd been dead for 20 years and her stories about spirits and hauntings had always seemed like quaint superstition. But as the lights drew closer, weaving between the stone formations with purposeful motion, I realized they weren't random phenomena. They were moving in formation, surrounding us, cutting off potential escape routes with tactical precision. "Don't follow them," I said urgently, remembering fragments of folklore. "Whatever you do, don't follow the lights." But Michael was already standing, his face slack with a dreamy expression I'd never seen before. "They're beautiful," he murmured. "They want to show us something." "Michael, no!" I grabbed his arm, but he shrugged me off with surprising strength. "It's okay, Rob. They're not going to hurt us. They just want us to come home." He walked toward the nearest cluster of lights with the same mechanical gait Sarah had displayed. As they enveloped him, I caught a glimpse of his face, peaceful, serene, and completely empty of anything I recognized as Michael. The lights began to move back toward our campsite, carrying Michael along like a leaf caught in a current. Jennifer and I followed at a distance, drawn by desperation rather than enchantment. We had to try to save him, even though I suspected we were walking into a trap. The scene that greeted us at the campsite defied description. The dark pools had expanded further, merging into a black lake that stretched to the horizon. Our tents and supplies floated on its surface like debris from a shipwreck, slowly sinking into depths that should not have been possible in this flat prairie landscape. Sarah stood on what might have been a shoreline, no longer bothering to maintain completely human form. Her skin had taken on a scaled, mottled appearance, and her limbs were too long, too flexible. When she saw us approaching, she smiled with a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth. Michael waded into the dark water without hesitation, moving deeper until the liquid reached his chest. As it touched him, his clothing began to dissolve, revealing skin that was turning the same mottled gray as Sarah's. He looked back at us once, and his eyes held that same terrible emptiness. "Come on in," he called, his voice already taking on that strange mechanical quality. "The water's fine." More shapes moved beneath the surface, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. I caught glimpses of red fur, of that single massive eye, of appendages that might have been tentacles or might have been something worse. The mini Washatu, or its offspring, or something that had never had a name because no one who'd seen it had lived to speak of it. "We can still run," I told Jennifer. "There has to be another way out." But even as I spoke, I could feel the wrongness spreading through my own mind like poison. The lights were so beautiful, the water so inviting. It would be so easy to just walk forward, to let the dark liquid close over my head, to stop fighting against forces so much older and more powerful than myself. Jennifer's grip on my arm was the only thing that kept me anchored to myself. "Rob," she whispered, "look at your hands." I looked down and saw with horror that my fingernails had begun to elongate, becoming translucent and sharp. Dark veins were visible beneath my skin, pulsing with a rhythm that didn't match my heartbeat, Whatever had taken Sarah and Michael was taking me too, slowly but inexorably. It's in the air, I realized with dawning terror. In the water, in the ground. We're breathing it in, absorbing it through our skin. The transformation was accelerating. I could feel my bones beginning to soften and change, my muscles reshaping themselves for an aquatic existence I didn't want. In my peripheral vision, I saw Jennifer swaying on her feet, her eyes taking on that dreamy, unfocused expression that meant she was losing herself to whatever force controlled this place. I thought about Sarah, about how efficiently she'd been replaced by something that wore her face but had never been human. I thought about Michael, now completely submerged except for the top of his head, diving down toward things that waited in the depths with endless patience. Soon, Jennifer and I would join them, and when other campers eventually stumbled into this trap, we'd be the ones to welcome them with borrowed voices and impossible smiles, unless… The pepper spray in Jennifer's camera bag. She'd been reaching for it when Sarah grabbed her, but in the chaos and terror we'd both forgotten about it. If I could reach it, if the chemicals might disrupt whatever process was changing us. I lunged for the bag which floated just within reach near the shoreline. My fingers closed around the canister just as something massive broke the surface behind me. I turned to see the mini Washatu in all its terrible glory. 20 feet of muscle and scales and rage, with that single yellow eye boring into my soul like a laser. Its mouth opened to reveal rows of teeth that belonged on no earthly creature, and the sound it made was like the screams of 1,000 drowning victims. But I was already moving, already spraying, emptying the entire canister into that hideous face. The creature reared back with a shriek that shattered stone, clawing at its eye with appendages that shifted and flowed like living liquid. Dark ichor sprayed from the wound, hissing where it hit the ground. The effect on our transformed friends was immediate. Sarah collapsed into the shallows, her stolen form rippling and dissolving as whatever force animated her retreated to tend its wounds. Michael surfaced, gasping and human again, his skin fading from gray back to its normal pale color. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Jennifer and pulling her away from the shoreline. "Run! Now!" We fled through a landscape that was rapidly returning to normal prairie grassland. The impossible lake drained away into nothing, leaving only damp earth and the lingering smell of rotting vegetation. The will-o'-the-wisps flickered and died, and for the first time in days I could hear normal sounds. Insects buzzing, birds calling, the distant lowing of cattle. Michael caught up with us after 100 yards, naked and shivering but undeniably human. We didn't stop running until we reached a paved road that definitely hadn't been there before, where a concerned rancher picked us up and drove us to the sheriff's station in Medora. The official report listed Sarah Rodriguez as missing, presumed dead, somewhere in the Little Missouri National Grassland. Search teams found no trace of her, no evidence of our campsite, nothing to suggest we'd ever been there at all. Our story was dismissed as a combination of hypothermia, dehydration, and group hysteria. But I know better. I know that somewhere in the badlands of western North Dakota, in a place that exists only when conditions are right, something ancient waits with infinite patience. It wears Sarah's face now, and her voice, and her memories. It knows how to smile and laugh and seem human enough to fool casual observers. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder how many other missing campers have fed its hunger over the years. How many other friends and lovers have been replaced by things that remember when this land was covered by water, when creatures older than human civilization ruled the depths. I moved to Florida 6 months ago, as far from water as I could manage. But even here, surrounded by strip malls and tourist attractions, I sometimes catch glimpses of that terrible intelligence in puddles after rain, in swimming pools that reflect no light, in the eyes of strangers who smile just a little too wide. The mini Washatu is patient. It's learned to wait, and I suspect that someday, when I've almost convinced myself it was all a nightmare, it will come calling with Sarah's face and Sarah's voice. When that day comes, I pray I'll be strong enough to run again, because next time, I don't think pepper spray will be enough to save me. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 31 years old. This happened in the rugged badlands of Little Missouri State Park, North Dakota, in early October 2024. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I swear on my life, what's left of it, that every word is true. It started as a simple weekend camping trip with my coworkers from Bismarck Insurance. 5 of us had been planning this getaway for months. Myself, Sarah Rodriguez from accounting, Kevin Walker from claims, Jennifer Lopez from underwriting, and David Brown from our IT department. We were all desperate to escape the fluorescent-lit tedium of our cubicles and experience something real in North Dakota's wild backcountry. Little Missouri State Park seemed perfect. 6,000 acres of pristine badlands terrain, over 40 miles of hiking trails, and remote enough that we'd truly disconnect from civilization. The seasonal park had just reopened after its winter closure, and we'd managed to snag one of the primitive campsites tucked away from the main equestrian areas. Site 47 sat on a ridge overlooking the winding Little Missouri River, surrounded by the jagged buttes and coulees that made this place feel like another planet. The drive from Bismarck took us 4 hours through increasingly desolate prairie, past abandoned homesteads and the occasional oil derrick flaring gas into the gray October sky. By the time we reached the park entrance near Killdeer, the sun was already sinking low, casting long shadows across the rust-colored rocks. Jesus, this place is in the middle of nowhere, Kevin muttered as we bounced along the gravel road toward our campsite. He was right. We hadn't seen another car for the last 30 miles. That's the point, Sarah said, her window down despite the chill. When's the last time any of us saw actual stars? Jennifer, our group's unofficial outdoors woman, had insisted on bringing all the proper gear: a 4-season tent, sleeping bags rated for below freezing temperatures, camp stoves, water purification tablets, and enough freeze-dried food for a week. David, predictably, had packed 3 different portable chargers and was already lamenting the lack of cell service. "My phone's been dead since we passed Dunn Center," he complained, waving his iPhone in the air. "How are we supposed to navigate the trails tomorrow?" "With these ancient devices called maps," Jennifer laughed, pulling out a topographical map of the park. "And compasses. Remember those?" We reached our campsite just as the last light was fading. The spot was more isolated than I'd expected. A small clearing surrounded by towering cottonwoods, their golden leaves rustling in the evening wind. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile away, and the only sounds were the distant murmur of the river and the haunting call of coyotes echoing off the canyon walls. Setting up camp in the growing darkness proved more challenging than expected. My hands were already numb from the cold as I struggled with tent stakes in the rocky soil. The temperature was dropping fast. Jennifer's thermometer read 38 degrees and falling. "This wind is brutal," Sarah said, her breath visible in white puffs. "It cuts right through you." Kevin had managed to get a fire started, but the flames guttered and danced in the gusts sweeping down from the bluffs. We huddled around it, passing a bottle of whiskey and sharing stories from work. For a while, everything felt normal, even pleasant. We were 5 friends escaping the daily grind, reconnecting with nature and each other. But there was something wrong with the darkness here. Even with our headlamps and the crackling fire, the night felt impossibly deep, as if it were pressing against us from all sides. The shadows between the trees seemed to writhe and shift, and every sound, the snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl, the distant splash from the river, made us jump. "You know," Jennifer said, studying her map by firelight, "we're not far from where that Native American battle happened. The locals call it the Devil's Canyon." "What battle?" David asked, feeding another log to the fire. "Some Lakota legend about a water monster that wiped out an entire war party. They say it came up from underground caverns connected to the Missouri River system." She traced a finger along the blue line marking the Little Missouri. The survivors claimed the creature had buffalo hair and a single red eye, with a spine like broken glass sticking out of its back. "Great bedtime story," Kevin said sarcastically, but I noticed him glance nervously at the dark water beyond the trees. Sarah laughed, but it sounded forced. "Come on, you don't actually believe that stuff." "The Arikara and Lakota have been telling these stories for centuries," Jennifer replied. "They wouldn't have persisted if there wasn't some truth to them." As if summoned by her words, a low howl drifted across the water, too deep and guttural to be a coyote, too wild to be domestic. It raised the hair on my arms and sent ice through my veins. "What the hell was that?" David whispered. The howl came again, closer this time, seeming to echo from multiple directions at once. Our fire suddenly felt pitifully small against the vast darkness surrounding us. "Just wolves," Jennifer said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe. Gray wolves have been spotted in the area." We sat in tense silence, listening to the night sounds. The wind had picked up, moaning through the rock formations and making the trees creak ominously. I found myself watching the tree line, convinced I could see shapes moving in the darkness, tall, gaunt figures that vanished whenever I turned my headlamp toward them. "I'm calling it a night," Sarah announced, clearly unnerved. "We've got that big hike planned for tomorrow." One by one, we doused the fire and retreated to our tents. Jennifer and Sarah shared the larger 4-person tent, while Kevin, David, and I squeezed into a smaller one. The wind buffeted our thin nylon walls all night, and I lay awake listening to strange sounds, footsteps circling our campsite, scratching noises against the tent fabric, and what sounded like whispered conversations in a language I didn't recognize. When morning finally came, gray and overcast, we discovered our campsite had been visited during the night. Our cooler had been dragged 20 feet from where we'd left it, its heavy lid torn completely off. The food inside was gone, not eaten but completely vanished, as if it had simply disappeared. Even stranger, there were no tracks in the soft earth around the cooler, no sign of what might have taken our supplies. "Bears?" Kevin suggested hopefully. "Bears would have left tracks," Jennifer said, examining the ground with a puzzled frown. "And they would have made a mess eating the food. This is different." The cooler itself was damaged in ways that didn't make sense. Deep gouges scored its sides, too narrow for bear claws, too jagged for human tools. They looked almost like bite marks, but from teeth the size of railroad spikes. Despite our unease, we decided to proceed with our planned hike. Jennifer had mapped out a route that would take us deep into the park's backcountry, following game trails through the most remote sections of the Badlands. We packed light, water, energy bars, first aid supplies, and emergency gear in case we got lost. The morning hike started well enough. The trail wound through spectacular scenery, towering rock formations carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes, hidden canyons where ancient cottonwoods grew beside clear springs, and vast overlooks where we could see for miles across the undulating prairie. The autumn air was crisp and clean, scented with sage and juniper. But as we penetrated deeper into the wilderness, I began to notice disturbing details. The trail markers were old and weathered, some completely illegible. Several times, Jennifer had to backtrack when the path simply vanished or split in confusing directions. Our GPS units, those that still had battery, showed wildly conflicting readings, placing us anywhere from our actual location to the middle of Lake Sakakawea. "Technology doesn't work right out here," Jennifer explained, though she sounded troubled. "Too much iron in the rocks, maybe, or underground watercourses affecting the magnetic field." More unsettling were the signs of death scattered throughout the landscape. We found the sun-bleached bones of deer and elk, picked clean and arranged in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Skulls grinned at us from rocky alcoves, their empty sockets following our movement. In one narrow canyon, we discovered what remained of a horse, still wearing a bridle and saddle, but reduced to scattered bones and scraps of leather. "That's recent," David observed, prodding a metal stirrup with his hiking pole. the leathers barely decomposed. Maybe it belonged to one of the park's trail riders, Sarah suggested. Horses get spooked and run off all the time. But Jennifer was shaking her head. No way a horse could have gotten this far from the main trails. And look at these bones. They've been cracked open. Something was after the marrow. By early afternoon, we'd reached our planned turnaround point, a scenic overlook called Devil's Perch that offered panoramic views of the Little Missouri River Valley. The name proved apt. The rocky outcrop jutted out over a sheer drop of nearly 200 feet, with only scattered handholds preventing a fatal fall. We were eating lunch and admiring the view when Kevin announced he needed to water the trees. He wandered off toward a cluster of junipers about 50 yards away, joking about finding privacy in the wilderness. We waited and waited. "Kevin," Sarah called after 20 minutes had passed. "You fall in a hole over there?" No response. Jennifer and I walked over to where we'd last seen him. His hiking poles were leaning against a tree, and his water bottle sat on a nearby rock. But Kevin himself was nowhere to be found. "Kevin!" we shouted, our voices echoing off the canyon walls. "This isn't funny." We searched the immediate area, calling his name and looking for any sign of where he might have gone. The ground was too rocky to hold clear footprints, but we found a few disturbing clues. Some torn fabric caught on a thorny bush and what looked like drag marks leading toward a narrow crevice in the rocks. "Maybe he fell into one of these cracks," David suggested, peering nervously into the black opening. "We should get help." But our cell phones remained dead, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. Jennifer decided we should split up to search. David and Sarah would follow the main trail back toward camp in case Kevin had become disoriented and headed the wrong direction, while Jennifer and I would explore the maze of canyons and coulees below the overlook. In retrospect, splitting up was the worst possible decision. But panic was setting in, and none of us were thinking clearly. Jennifer and I spent 3 hours scrambling through increasingly treacherous terrain, following deer paths and dry washes deeper into the badlands. The landscape became more alien and hostile the farther we went. Twisted rock formations that looked like frozen screams, hidden sinkholes that could swallow a person without a trace, and an oppressive silence broken only by the whisper of wind through stone. "We need to head back," Jennifer finally said as the afternoon light began to fade. "It'll be dark soon, and we can't help Kevin if we get lost ourselves." We retraced our steps to Devil's Perch, where we expected to meet David and Sarah. But they weren't there. Their backpacks sat exactly where they'd left them, but both of them had vanished as completely as Kevin. "No, no, no," Jennifer whispered, her face pale. "This can't be happening." I felt the first real stab of terror then, a cold certainty that something was hunting us. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe our friends had found Kevin and were helping him. Maybe they'd gotten lost on their way back. But my primitive brain knew better. This place was wrong, malevolent, and we were trapped in its embrace. The sun was setting as we hurried back toward our campsite, half running through terrain that had seemed merely challenging in daylight but now felt actively malicious. Every shadow could hide an attacker. Every sound might herald our doom. When we finally stumbled into our clearing, gasping and exhausted, we found fresh horrors waiting. Our tents had been shredded, their contents scattered across the campsite. Sleeping bags lay in tatters, their synthetic filling drifting like snow in the evening breeze. Our remaining supplies were gone. Food, water, even our car keys had vanished. "We're fucked," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Jennifer was examining the ruined tents with her flashlight. "Look at these cuts," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Whatever did this has claws like razors." But what chilled me most was the smell that permeated our campsite. A sickly sweet stench of decay mixed with something wild and musky, like the scent of a predator's den. It clung to everything, making my stomach heave. We salvaged what we could, a torn but usable sleeping bag, a partial first aid kit, and a few energy bars that had been overlooked in the destruction. Without our stove, we couldn't risk a fire that might attract whatever had done this to our camp. "We'll wait until morning," Jennifer decided. "Then we'll hike out to the road and flag down help." We huddled together in the ruins of our campsite, taking turns keeping watch while the other tried to sleep. But rest was impossible. The darkness around us seemed alive with movement and menace. Branches snapped in the distance, followed by low growls that might have been wind through the rocks, or might not. Something large crashed through the underbrush near the river, and once I could have sworn I heard Kevin's voice calling my name from deep in the trees. But it wasn't quite right. The cadence was off, too slow and deliberate, as if something else was trying to imitate human speech. Dawn brought no relief. If anything, the daylight revealed new terrors. Our destroyed campsite was surrounded by strange markings, symbols scratched into the bark of trees and carved into the rocky ground. They looked almost like some primitive alphabet, but one that hurt to look at directly, as if the shapes themselves were hostile to human comprehension. "We're leaving, now," Jennifer said, shouldering her damaged backpack. But as we started toward the trail that would lead us back to the parking area and our cars, Kevin emerged from the tree line. At first, we were overjoyed. He looked unharmed, dirty and disheveled, but walking normally and apparently unhurt. Jennifer ran toward him with tears of relief streaming down her face. "Kevin, thank God. We were so worried. Where have you been? What happened to you?" But as he drew closer, the relief curdled into something else. Something was wrong with Kevin's face. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his eyes seemed too large, too dark. When he smiled, I caught a glimpse of teeth that looked different, sharper, more numerous than they should be. "I got lost," he said, and his voice was the same one I'd heard calling from the darkness. Too slow, too deliberate. But I found my way back. Jennifer was hugging him, babbling questions about where he'd been and what had happened. But Kevin's attention was fixed on me, and his smile never wavered. There was no recognition in his eyes, no acknowledgement of our shared fear and relief. He looked at me the way a cat looks at a mouse, patient, predatory, already certain of the outcome. "Where are David and Sarah?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. Kevin's head tilted at an unnatural angle. "They're around." "What do you mean, around? We looked everywhere for all of you." "They're close," Kevin said, and now I could see that his fingernails had grown long and yellow, more like claws than human nails. "They're waiting." Jennifer finally seemed to notice something was wrong. She pulled back from Kevin, studying his face with growing alarm. "Kevin, are you feeling okay? You look—" He moved faster than anything human had a right to move. One moment he was standing 3 feet away. The next, his hand was wrapped around Jennifer's throat, lifting her off the ground with inhuman strength. Her feet kicked uselessly as she clawed at his fingers, her face turning red, then purple. I launched myself at him, tackling him around the waist and driving us both to the ground. Jennifer collapsed, gasping and choking, while Kevin and I rolled across the rocky earth. His strength was incredible. It was like wrestling with a machine made of steel cables and concrete. His fingers dug into my arms, and I felt something warm and wet running down my skin. "You smell like fear," Kevin whispered in my ear, his breath carrying that same sickly sweet stench that had polluted our campsite. "I can taste it." I managed to grab a rock and smash it against his skull. Any normal person would have been stunned, but Kevin barely seemed to notice. He backhanded me casually, and I flew through the air to crash against a tree trunk. Stars exploded across my vision, and I tasted blood. When I struggled to my feet, Kevin was advancing on Jennifer again. She was trying to crawl away, still gasping for breath, but he caught her ankle and began dragging her toward the tree line. "No!" I screamed, looking around desperately for a weapon. My fingers closed around a broken tent pole, one end sharp where the metal had snapped. I ran at Kevin and drove the improvised spear deep into his back. He dropped Jennifer and spun to face me. Black fluid leaked from the wound, but it didn't seem to slow him down. If anything, he looked amused. "That hurt," he said conversationally. "Now it's my turn." He rushed at me with inhuman speed. I barely managed to sidestep, and his claws, they were definitely claws now, curved and razor-sharp, raked across my chest instead of my throat. The pain was indescribable, like being touched with white-hot iron. Jennifer saved my life. While Kevin was focused on me, she grabbed a burning branch from the smoldering remains of our campfire and thrust it into his face. He shrieked, a sound no human throat could make, high and piercing like steam escaping from a broken valve. The stench of burning flesh filled the air. Kevin staggered backward, clawing at his face, and Jennifer grabbed my hand. "Run!" We plunged into the forest, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs in our desperation to escape. Behind us, Kevin's inhuman howls echoed through the trees, joined by other voices. Sarah's laugh, twisted into something cruel and mocking, and David's voice calling our names with that same wrong cadence. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, then collapsed behind a massive boulder to catch our breath. Blood from my chest wounds had soaked through my shirt, and Jennifer's throat was purple with bruises from Kevin's grip. "What was that thing?" she whispered. "I don't know, but it wasn't Kevin. Not anymore." We could hear them hunting us. Branches breaking, rocks clattering, and those awful voices calling to us in tones that might once have been human. They seemed to be everywhere at once, driving us deeper into the wilderness maze. "The car," Jennifer said. "If we can reach the parking area." But when we finally made it to where we'd left our vehicles, we found them destroyed. The tires had been slashed, the windows shattered, and the engine blocks torn apart as if by enormous hands. Vital components lay scattered across the gravel, twisted into unrecognizable shapes. They don't want us to leave, I realized. That's when we saw them, Kevin, David, and Sarah emerging from the tree line. They moved wrong, with a flowing, predatory grace that no human being possessed. In the fading light, I could see that their transformations had progressed. Their clothes hung in tatters from frames that had grown unnaturally tall and gaunt. Their skin had taken on a grayish, mottled appearance, and their eyes reflected light like an animal's. Sarah's mouth had split open at the corners, extending her grin almost to her ears and revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. David's fingers had elongated into twisted claws, and his neck had stretched until his head sat at an unnatural angle. But Kevin was the worst. His entire face had reorganized itself around a lamprey-like mouth filled with concentric rings of teeth. "We've been waiting for you," Sarah said, her voice a sibilant whisper. "We're so hungry, and you smell delicious." They began advancing, and I knew we had only seconds before they reached us. The parking area was surrounded by open ground, nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. That's when I remembered the park's emergency radio. Jennifer had mentioned it during our planning, an emergency communication station near the visitor center, about half a mile from the parking area. If we could reach it— "The radio," I told Jennifer. "The emergency station. It's our only chance." We sprinted across the open ground as our former friends gave chase. The things that had been Kevin, David, and Sarah moved with terrible speed, bounding across the landscape on all fours like huge wolves. Their hunting cries echoed off the surrounding bluffs, a sound that would haunt my nightmares forever. The emergency station was a small concrete building with a radio antenna and a steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." I grabbed a rock and smashed the lock while Jennifer kept watch. The door swung open to reveal a basic radio setup and emergency supplies. My hands shook as I tried to work the radio controls. Static filled the speaker, broken by occasional fragments of distant conversations. Finally, I managed to raise someone, a park ranger at Theodore Roosevelt National Park, nearly 100 miles away. "This is an emergency," I gasped into the microphone. "Little Missouri State Park. People dead or missing. Need immediate help." The response was scratchy but audible. "Copy that. What's your situation?" Before I could answer, the steel door exploded inward. Kevin, or the thing that had been Kevin, crouched in the opening, his transformed face barely recognizable as human. Behind him, I could see the others waiting in the darkness. "Found you," Kevin hissed. I grabbed a flare from the emergency supplies and ignited it, holding the blazing magnesium between us. Kevin recoiled from the light, but I could see him gathering himself for a final attack. That's when the helicopters arrived. I learned later that my radio call had been picked up by multiple stations, including law enforcement and military frequencies. Within an hour, a combined search and rescue operation was mobilized. State police, National Guard, and federal agents who specialized in unusual incidents. The rescue teams found Jennifer and me barricaded in the radio station, both of us nearly catatonic with terror and blood loss. They also found the remains of our campsite and the destroyed vehicles. But of Kevin, David, and Sarah, there was no trace. The authorities searched for days, bringing in helicopters, tracking dogs, and specialized equipment. They found some disturbing evidence, more of those strange symbols carved into trees, areas where the vegetation had died in perfect circles, and caves that descended far deeper into the earth than any geological survey had indicated. But they never found our friends. The official report listed Kevin Walker, David Brown, and Sarah Rodriguez as missing persons, presumed dead due to exposure or wild animal attacks. Jennifer and I were treated for severe injuries and psychological trauma, then released after extensive debriefing sessions with federal agents who asked very specific questions about what we'd seen and experienced. We were strongly encouraged not to discuss the incident publicly. Jennifer lasted 3 weeks before she couldn't take it anymore. I found her in her apartment bathroom, surrounded by empty prescription bottles. Her suicide note was a single sentence: "They're still hunting me." I moved away from North Dakota after that, settling in a small town in Oregon where I thought I could start over. But the nightmares never stopped. Every night I dream about the Badlands, about dark figures moving through twisted rock formations, about voices calling my name in tones that aren't quite human. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I hear scratching at my windows. Soft, persistent sounds like claws against glass. When I work up the courage to look, there's never anything there. But in the morning, I find marks in the dirt beneath my windowsill, symbols that match the ones we saw carved into the trees at Little Missouri State Park. I know they're still out there. Whatever consumed my friends, whatever twisted them into those hungry, hollow things, it's not finished with me. It's patient, but it's coming. I'm writing this down as a warning. Don't go to Little Missouri State Park. Don't trust the official reports that claim it's safe. The Badlands hold something ancient and malevolent, something that feeds on human flesh and souls, and if you're reading this after I've disappeared, know that the hunger has finally found me. The darkness I thought I'd escaped has tracked me across 1,000 miles, and now it's time to pay the price for witnessing what should never be seen. The scratching at my window's getting louder. They're here. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Little Missouri National Grassland, North Dakota, about 30 miles south of the abandoned town of Amadon, in October of last year. I should have known something was wrong when the GPS started glitching. My best friend Jake had been planning this camping trip for months. "Just the two of us, Mike," he'd said, spreading maps across my kitchen table. "No cell towers, no Wi-Fi, no bullshit. Just us and 1,000,000 acres of nothing." Jake Phillips was the kind of guy who could sell ice to an Eskimo. All charm and enthusiasm with that infectious grin that made you forget he'd gotten us into trouble more times than I could count. The Little Missouri National Grassland stretched before us like an ocean of amber grass, broken only by the occasional butte or coulee carved deep into the earth by ancient waters. We'd driven for hours on increasingly rough roads until the last gravel path petered out into nothing more than twin tire tracks disappearing into the wilderness. "Perfect," Jake had said. "Exactly what we were looking for." That first night, everything seemed normal. We set up camp in a shallow depression between two low hills, sheltered from the October wind that never seemed to stop in this God-forsaken place. The silence was profound. not peaceful but oppressive, like the weight of all that emptiness pressing down on us. Even our campfire seemed to make too much noise, crackling and popping in the vast quiet. Jesus, it's dark out here, I muttered, feeding another branch to the flames. Beyond our small circle of light, the darkness was absolute. No moon, no stars visible through the thick cloud cover that had rolled in as the sun set. Jake laughed, but it sounded forced. That's the point, man. When's the last time you saw real darkness? This is what our ancestors lived with every night. I wasn't sure our ancestors were any happier about it than I was. We'd brought enough food for 5 days, planning to hike deeper into the grassland each morning and return to our base camp each night. Simple plan. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. The second day, Jake's phone died. Not just the battery, the whole device. When he tried to turn it on, the screen flickered with strange patterns, geometric shapes that hurt to look at before going black forever. My phone lasted until that evening, but the GPS had been acting strange all day, showing us in places we couldn't possibly be, sometimes placing us hundreds of miles away, sometimes not placing us anywhere at all. Technology, Jake said with a shrug, but I caught him staring at his dead phone with an expression I'd never seen before, something between confusion and fear. That night, the fire wouldn't stay lit. We'd built it the same way as before, used the same dry wood we'd gathered from a fallen cottonwood near a dried creek bed. But every time we got it going, it would sputter and die within minutes. The wood would flare, burn bright orange for a moment, then fade to cold ash as if some invisible force was sucking the life out of it. Must be the wind, Jake said, but there was no wind. We gave up trying and huddled in our sleeping bags, listening to sounds that had no business being in an empty grassland. Scratching, footsteps, something large moving through the grass just beyond our sight. When I worked up the courage to shine my flashlight into the darkness, there was nothing there but endless prairie stretching into black nothing. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Jake, though he pretended to. The third day, we decided to pack up and head for higher ground. Better vantage point, Jake said, but I knew he was as spooked as I was. We loaded our packs and started hiking northwest, toward a series of buttes we could see rising from the grassland like ancient monuments. That's when we found the bones. They were scattered in a rough circle around what must have once been a campsite. White bones, picked clean, some of them clearly human. A skull grinned up at us from the grass, the jaw hanging open as if in perpetual scream. Ribs lay scattered like broken fingers. Femurs and tibias formed an obscene pattern around a cold fire pit filled with ash and something that might have been more bones. Jesus Christ, Jake whispered, backing away. What the hell happened here? I was studying the scene more carefully, my stomach churning. Look at the bones, I said. Look at the marks on them. Every bone bore deep gouges, as if they'd been gnawed by teeth. Not animal teeth. The marks were wrong for that. Too regular, too purposeful. Human teeth, but larger, stronger. We need to get out of here, I said. Jake nodded, but when we tried to retrace our steps, we couldn't find our own trail. The grass showed no sign of our passage, no broken stems or trampled earth. It was as if we'd materialized in that place of death without ever walking there. We hiked for hours, panic rising in our throats like bile. The landscape began to repeat itself. The same cluster of rocks, the same twisted shrub, the same coulee cutting through the earth. We were walking in circles, but that was impossible. I'd been navigating by the sun, keeping it to our left as we tried to head south back to camp. But the sun wasn't moving. It hung in the western sky, motionless, neither rising nor setting. Time itself seemed broken in that place. This is fucked, Jake said, his voice cracking. This is so fucked. As darkness fell, somehow, despite the motionless sun, we made a new camp. No fire this time. We huddled together in our sleeping bags, backs pressed against each other, flashlights clutched in white-knuckled fists. That's when we heard the voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a low whisper that seemed to rise from the earth itself. At first, it was just sound without meaning, like wind through hollow bones. But gradually, words began to form. Hungry, so hungry. Come to me. Jake grabbed my arm. Did you hear that? I nodded, unable to speak. The voice was getting closer, or maybe we were getting closer to it. The whisper became a moan, then a cry of desperate need that made my skin crawl. Feed me. I need. Something moved in the darkness beyond our circle of light. Tall. Much taller than a man. It swayed back and forth like a tree in a strong wind, but there was no wind. When it stepped forward, the ground trembled under its weight. I shined my flashlight toward the sound and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing that looked back at me had once been human. Maybe. It stood at least 8 feet tall, thin as a skeleton but wrong in proportions no skeleton should have. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands with fingers like broken twigs. Its skin was gray as ash, stretched tight over prominent bones, and its face. God, its face. The eyes were black pits that reflected my light like dark water. Its mouth was too wide, filled with yellowed teeth that came to sharp points. Lips that might have once been human had been chewed away, leaving only bloody stumps around that horrible grin. But the worst part was that I recognized it. The bone structure, the basic shape of the skull. It looked like Jake. Not exactly, but close enough to make my blood freeze. Like someone had taken Jake and stretched him, starved him, transformed him into something monstrous. Feed me, it whispered, and the voice was Jake's voice, distorted and wrong. I stumbled backward, falling over my pack. When I looked up, the thing was gone. Jake was shaking beside me, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the empty grass. What was that? He gasped. What the hell was that? I couldn't tell him. Couldn't explain that the monster had worn his face. We didn't sleep that night. We sat back to back, weapons ready, knives from our packs, anything that might serve as protection against whatever was stalking us in the darkness. Every sound made us jump. Every shifting shadow could be death coming for us. Dawn came eventually, though it seemed to take forever. With the pale morning light, our terror seemed almost foolish. Just another night in the wilderness, our minds playing tricks on us. We were exhausted, hungry, probably dehydrated. No wonder we were seeing things. We need to find water, Jake said, and he was right. Our bottles were nearly empty and we'd been rationing for the past day. I'm going to check that coulee we passed yesterday. Might be a stream down there. I'll come with you, I said quickly. The last thing I wanted was to be separated. But Jake shook his head. Someone should stay with the camp. Make sure our gear doesn't blow away. I'll be back in an hour, 2 at most. Against my better judgment, I let him go. Watched him disappear over a low rise, his red jacket bright against the endless brown grass. That was the last time I saw the real Jake Phillips. He came back 3 hours later, but he came back wrong. The change was subtle at first. He moved differently, more fluid but somehow off balance, like someone learning to walk in a body that didn't quite fit. His smile was too wide, lasting too long. When he blinked, it was slow and deliberate, like he had to remember to do it. "Find any water?" I asked. "Water." He stared at me for a long moment, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Oh, yes, water. But he hadn't brought any back. His bottles were still empty. As the day wore on, the wrongness became more pronounced. Jake forgot things he should have remembered. The names of mutual friends, the reason we'd come on this trip, stories from our childhood that we'd shared 100 times. When I brought up his ex-girlfriend Sarah, he looked at me blankly. "Sarah," he said. "Who's Sarah?" He'd been planning to propose to her before she left him 3 months ago. It had nearly destroyed him. But worse than the memory loss was his appetite. Jake had always been a big eater, but now he seemed ravenous. He tore through his remaining food supplies like a starving animal, cramming MREs and energy bars into his mouth without bothering to heat them. When his food was gone, he stared at mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Hungry," he said, and his voice had that same whisper quality I'd heard in the darkness. "So hungry." That night I pretended to sleep while keeping one eye on Jake. He sat motionless by our dead fire pit, staring out into the darkness. Sometimes his head would turn with sharp, bird-like movements, tracking sounds I couldn't hear. Once, I could have sworn I saw him smile at something in the darkness, his teeth gleaming in the faint starlight. Around 3 in the morning, he stood up and walked away from camp. I should have followed him, should have demanded to know where he was going. Instead, I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, paralyzed by fear and the terrible certainty that the thing wearing Jake's face wasn't my friend anymore. He was gone for 2 hours. When he came back, there was blood on his hands. "Where did you go?" I asked the next morning, trying to keep my voice casual. He looked at me with those 2 black eyes and smiled that too wide smile. "Hunting," he said. "Hunting what?" "Food." He offered to share his breakfast with me, strips of what he claimed was jerky, dark red and still slightly warm. The smell made my stomach turn, but not from hunger. It smelled wrong, sweet and metallic, like copper pennies and rotting meat. "No thanks," I said. "I'm not hungry." His expression darkened. For just a moment, I saw something predatory flash across his features, gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "You need to eat," he said. "Keep your strength up." "I have my own food." "Mine's better." He held out a strip of the meat, and I could see that it was still bloody in the center. "Fresh." I backed away, my hand moving instinctively to the knife on my belt. I said no. For a long moment, we stared at each other. Then that horrible smile returned to his face. "Suit yourself," he said, and began eating the bloody meat with obvious relish. That's when I knew I had to run. I waited until afternoon, when he wandered off again on one of his mysterious hunts. The moment he was out of sight, I grabbed my pack and started walking. Not toward our truck, that was too obvious, and I wasn't even sure I could find it. Instead, I headed east, toward where I hoped civilization might be. The grassland stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling hills of brown grass beneath a gray sky. My feet found an old animal trail, and I followed it desperately, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. Every shadow could be Jake, or the thing that had been Jake, following me. I'd been walking for maybe 2 hours when I heard the howl behind me. It started low and human, then rose to something no human throat could produce. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the hills and coulées. It was hungry and angry and filled with a desperate need that made my bones ache to hear it. I ran. The animal trail wound through a series of low valleys, past dry creek beds and standing stones that looked almost like ancient monuments. I stumbled and fell, picked myself up, kept running. Behind me, the howling continued, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there. As evening approached, I found myself in a landscape I didn't recognize. The grass gave way to broken badlands, all twisted rock formations and deep gullies carved by wind and water. I scrambled up a steep slope, hoping to get a better view of the country, find some landmark that might guide me to safety. At the top of the ridge, I looked back. Jake was following me. But it wasn't Jake anymore. Not really. The thing that moved across the grassland below had his basic shape, but all the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, arms and legs stretched like taffy. It moved with an inhuman gait, taking steps far too long for any normal person. And it was gaining on me. I slid down the other side of the ridge, landing hard in a dry wash. Sharp rocks cut through my clothes, drawing blood, but I barely felt it. Terror had numbed me to everything except the need to run. The wash led to a deeper canyon, its walls rising high on either side. I followed it blindly, having no choice but to trust that it would lead me somewhere other than a dead end. Behind me, I could hear the thing that had been Jake climbing down the ridge, rocks clattering under its feet. The canyon narrowed, the walls closing in until I could touch both sides with my outstretched arms. Panic began to compete with terror, claustrophobia mixing with the fear of what was hunting me. The space became tighter and tighter until I was squeezing sideways through a gap barely wide enough for my body. Then I heard it breathing behind me. The sound was wet and labored, like someone with fluid in their lungs trying to draw air. It echoed off the canyon walls, amplified and distorted until it seemed to come from inside my own head. Michael. The voice was Jake's, but wrong, stretched and distorted like everything else about him. It drifted through the narrow gap behind me, followed by the scraping sound of something too large trying to force its way through. I squeezed through the narrowest part of the gap and stumbled into a wider section of canyon. My flashlight beam revealed smooth rock walls stretching up into darkness. No way up, no way out except back the way I'd come. I was trapped. The scraping sounds grew louder. Whatever Jake had become, it was working its way through the gap. I could hear pieces of rock falling, the wet sound of flesh being torn, but still it kept coming. I pressed myself against the far wall and waited. The thing that emerged from the gap barely resembled my friend anymore. Its body had elongated even further, stretched and twisted until it looked more like a massive spider than a human being. Its skin had turned the color of old bone, pulled tight over a frame that was all sharp angles and protruding joints. But the face, God, the face was still recognizably Jake's, just wrong in every possible way. The eyes were black holes, empty of everything that had once made them human. The mouth had stretched to accommodate rows of yellowed teeth, each one filed to a point. When it smiled at me, I could see that its tongue had become something long and prehensile, like a snake's. "Found you," it whispered and began moving toward me with that horrible fluid grace. I fumbled for my knife, knowing it was useless but needing something in my hands. The blade seemed pitiful against the monster bearing down on me, but it was all I had. "Jake," I said, hoping some part of my friend might still be in there. "Jake, it's me. It's Mike." It paused, tilting its head like a curious bird. "Jake," it repeated as if tasting the word. No Jake, only hunger. That's when I saw the bones. They were scattered around the canyon floor, half hidden in shadow and debris. Human bones, picked clean, just like the ones we'd found at that first campsite. Skulls grinned up at me from dark corners. Femurs and ribs formed twisted patterns on the rock. How many others had found their way into this trap? How many had Jake, or the thing Jake had become, lured here to feed on? "You smell good," the creature said, taking another step closer. "Warm, alive. I remember what that was like." It lunged at me then, moving faster than anything that size should have been able to move. I threw myself sideways, slashing wildly with the knife. The blade connected with something that felt like leather stretched over bone, and the creature shrieked, a sound like nails on a chalkboard that seemed to go on forever. Black blood, thick as tar, poured from the wound, but instead of slowing it down, the injury only seemed to enrage it further. It spun toward me, those impossibly long arms reaching out like grasping tree branches. One of its hands, if they could still be called hands, wrapped around my ankle. The fingers were cold as ice, and where they touched my skin, I felt a numbness spreading up my leg. It began dragging me toward its mouth, and I could see rows of teeth waiting to tear me apart. I brought the knife down on its wrist with all the strength I had left. The blade bit deep, severing tendons and scraping bone. The creature released me with another shriek, stumbling backward and clutching its damaged arm. That gave me the opening I needed. I scrambled toward the narrow gap, fighting through the pain in my injured leg. Behind me, the creature was already recovering, the wound beginning to close with an obscene wet sound. But I had a head start, and terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I squeezed through the gap, rocks tearing at my clothes and skin. The creature followed, and I could hear it struggling to fit its elongated frame through the narrow space. For a moment, I thought it might be stuck, But then I heard the sickening sound of bones breaking and reforming as it forced itself through. I ran through the canyon, following the twisting path as it gradually widened. My lungs burned, my leg throbbed where those cold fingers had touched me, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The thing that had been Jake was right behind me, and I could hear its labored breathing echoing off the canyon walls. The canyon opened into a wider valley, and in the distance I could see lights. Actual electric lights, strung between poles. A road. Civilization. I've never been so happy to see anything in my life. I stumbled toward the lights, my legs giving out more than once. Each time I fell, I could hear the creature getting closer, could almost feel its breath on the back of my neck. But somehow, I made it to the road just as a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. I stood in the middle of the asphalt, waving my arms and screaming for help. The truck, a battered pickup driven by a local rancher, slammed on its brakes and skidded to a stop just inches from me. "Jesus Christ, son, what happened to you?" the driver asked, jumping out of the cab. I looked back toward the canyon mouth, expecting to see the creature pursuing me. But there was nothing there, just empty darkness and the wind moving through the grass. "My friend," I gasped. "Something happened to my friend." The rancher, his name was Bill Kowalski, and he'd lived in that area his whole life. Listened to my story with the kind of expression you'd expect. Concerned, but skeptical. He called the sheriff, who called in a search and rescue team. They found our campsite 2 days later, along with our truck. But they never found Jake. The official report listed him as missing. Presumed dead. Exposure, they said. Maybe a fall into one of the deep coulées that scored the grassland. It was easy to get lost out there. Easy to make a mistake that could kill you. I never told them what I really saw. Who would believe it? But I know the truth. Jake Phillips died in that wilderness, and something else came back wearing his face. Something old and hungry that had been waiting in the grassland for God knows how long, waiting for someone to get lost and desperate enough to feed it. The Sioux have a word for it. Wendigo. A creature born of cannibalism and endless hunger, doomed to wander the empty places of the world, searching for fresh meat to sustain its cursed existence. Bill Kowalski knew the stories. When I finally worked up the courage to ask him about it, months later, he just nodded grimly. "My grandfather used to warn us about going too deep into the grassland," he said, "especially in winter when folks got desperate. He said there were things out there that had once been men, before they made the choice to eat human flesh to survive." "You believe that?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the endless prairie stretching to the horizon. "I believe there are things in this world we don't understand," he finally said, "and I believe some hungers can never be satisfied." I moved away from North Dakota after that. Couldn't stand being so close to that place knowing what was still out there. But sometimes, late at night, I think about Jake, about what he became, about whether he's still wandering that grassland, searching for lost campers and hunters to feed his endless appetite. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear his voice calling my name. Hungry. So hungry. "Come back to me, Mike." I never will, but I know he's still waiting. The numbness in my leg never went away completely. Where those cold fingers touched me, the skin has remained pale and sensitive to cold. Doctors can't explain it, but I know what it means. It's a mark, a connection to something I barely escaped. Last month I found scratches on my bedroom window, long, deep gouges in the glass that hadn't been there before. And in my dreams, I sometimes see Jake standing in empty fields, impossibly tall and thin, smiling that horrible smile as he beckons me to join him. The hunger is spreading. I can feel it sometimes, a hollow ache in my chest that no amount of food can fill. I try not to think about what that means. Try not to imagine what I might be becoming. But the dreams are getting stronger, and the hunger is getting worse. If you're reading this and you're thinking about camping in the remote wilderness of North Dakota, please don't. Or if you do, stay close to civilization. Don't venture too deep into those empty places where the grass grows tall and the wind never stops. Because something is waiting there. Something that wears familiar faces and speaks with trusted voices. Something that will follow you home if you let it. And once it marks you, there's no escape. The hunger never ends. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Little Missouri National Grassland, North Dakota, 3 weeks ago. I should have listened to the park ranger at the CCC campground when he warned us about the remote backcountry sections. Should have paid attention to his weathered hands trembling slightly as he pointed to areas on our map and muttered something about things that walk where they shouldn't. But we were young, cocky, and desperate to escape our dead-end jobs in Minneapolis for a long weekend of hiking and camping in what we assumed would be empty, peaceful badlands. There were 4 of us: myself, my college roommate David Jones, his girlfriend Sarah Rodriguez, and our mutual friend from work, Jennifer Williams. No relation, despite the shared surname. We'd been planning this trip for months, poring over maps of the Little Missouri National Grassland's most remote sections, areas where you could hike for days without seeing another soul. The plan was simple: drive out to the Burning Coal Vein campground, use it as our base for the first night, then pack in deep into the wilderness for 2 nights of backcountry camping before hiking back out. David was our unofficial leader, the kind of guy who approached everything with military precision despite never serving a day. Tall, broad-shouldered, with short brown hair and an intensity that sometimes made people uncomfortable. He'd researched every trail, every water source, every potential hazard we might encounter. Sarah was quieter, more thoughtful, with long black hair she kept in a perpetual braid and an uncanny ability to spot wildlife before anyone else. Jennifer was the jokester of our group, always quick with a sarcastic comment to lighten the mood, though I'd noticed she'd been more subdued lately, something about family issues she didn't want to discuss. We arrived at Burning Coal Vein just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the badlands in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too vivid to be real. The campground was smaller than I'd expected, only 8 sites, and we were the only ones there. The ranger station was a small wooden building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s, and the ranger himself seemed to match the vintage. He was probably in his 60s, with gray hair and pale blue eyes that held something I couldn't quite identify. Worry, maybe. Or fear. "You folks sure you want to head out into the backcountry?" he asked as David spread our topographic map across the counter. "Been some incidents lately. Wildlife acting strange. Folks getting turned around easy, even experienced hikers." David scoffed. "We've got GPS, compass, plenty of water, and emergency beacons. We'll be fine." The ranger's finger traced our planned route, stopping at a remote area marked Alkali Creek Canyon, about 15 miles northeast of the campground. "This area here," he said, tapping the map, "maybe consider staying closer to the established trails. The Ma Da Hay Trail runs right through here, plenty scenic, lots of other campers around if you need help." "That's exactly what we're trying to avoid," Sarah said with a laugh. "We want to get away from people, not closer to them." The ranger looked at her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Your choice. Just, if you hear anything strange at night, anything that doesn't sound quite right, don't investigate. Pack up and move. Trust me on that." Jennifer rolled her eyes after we left the ranger station. "Jesus, what was that about? Don't investigate strange sounds? What are we, characters in a horror movie?" We all laughed, but I noticed David folded the map carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket instead of his backpack. Just in case. That first night at the campground was perfect. We set up our tents in a rough circle around a fire pit, cooked a dinner of camp stove pasta and dehydrated vegetables, and watched the stars emerge in a sky so clear it seemed like you could reach up and pluck them from the darkness. The only sounds were the crackling of our fire and the distant howl of coyotes. So far away they sounded like whispers. "This is exactly what I needed. Sarah said, leaning against David's shoulder as she stared into the flames. Complete silence. No deadlines, no emails, no pressure. Speak for yourself, Jennifer said, pulling her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders. I keep expecting my phone to ring even though there's no signal out here. I think I'm having withdrawal. I checked my phone reflexively and confirmed what I already knew. No bars, no connection to the outside world. It should have felt liberating, but something about the complete isolation made me uneasy. Not fear, exactly, just a heightened awareness that if something went wrong out here, we were truly on our own. We headed into the backcountry early the next morning, leaving the comfort of the established campground behind for the raw wilderness of the grassland's remote sections. The terrain was more varied than I'd expected. Rolling hills covered in short grass gave way to deep ravines and rocky outcroppings that jutted from the earth like broken bones. The Badlands lived up to their name. This was a harsh, unforgiving landscape that seemed designed to test anyone foolish enough to venture into it unprepared. David led us along a game trail that wound through the heart of Alkali Creek Canyon, a narrow gorge with steep walls on either side and a small creek running along the bottom. The water was clear but tasted metallic, and Sarah cautioned us to treat it carefully with our purification tablets despite its apparent cleanliness. Something's not right about it, she said, kneeling beside the creek and cupping a handful of water. Smell it. I knelt beside her and inhaled. She was right. Beneath the clean mineral scent of mountain water was something else. Something organic and faintly sweet, like meat that had been left out too long. Probably just runoff from upstream, David said, but he still treated his water with extra purification tablets before drinking it. We hiked for 6 hours before finding what David declared to be our perfect campsite, a small clearing beside the creek, protected on 3 sides by canyon walls and open to the south for easy access. There was even a natural fire ring made from stones that other campers had left behind, though the blackened logs inside looked old and weathered. Who else has been here? Jennifer asked, examining the fire ring. I thought this area was supposed to be completely remote. Hunters, maybe, David said, or other backpackers from years ago. These stones have been here a while. We set up camp as the afternoon light began to fade, working efficiently to get our tents erected and our gear organized before darkness fell. The silence out here was different from the campground, deeper, more complete. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the canyon walls absorbed sound rather than echoing it. That's when we heard the first strange noise. It started as a low humming, almost like the sound of electrical wires, but organic somehow. The kind of sound that made you stop what you were doing and tilt your head, trying to identify the source. It lasted for perhaps 30 seconds, then faded away, leaving us all looking at each other with raised eyebrows. What the hell was that? Jennifer asked. David shrugged. Probably just whined through the rocks. These canyon formations can create weird acoustic effects. But I noticed he checked his GPS unit after that, confirming our coordinates and marking our campsite carefully, just in case. The humming came again after dinner, longer this time and with a strange harmonic quality that made my teeth ache. Sarah was the first to notice that it seemed to be coming from upstream, deeper in the canyon where the walls closed together and the creek disappeared into shadows. Should we check it out? She asked. Absolutely not, David said immediately. Remember what the ranger said? Strange sounds mean we pack up and move. Come on, Jennifer laughed. You're not seriously spooked by some weird wind noise, are you? I thought you were our fearless leader. David's jaw tightened. I'm our sensible leader, and sensible leaders don't investigate mysterious sounds in the middle of nowhere. But curiosity won out over caution. After some debate, we decided to post watch shifts through the night. 2 people awake at all times, just in case. David and Sarah took first watch, Jennifer and I would take second, then David and I would finish out the night until dawn. The first shift passed without incident. David woke me at midnight reporting nothing more exciting than an owl hooting somewhere in the darkness. Jennifer and I settled in beside the dying fire, feeding it small pieces of wood to keep it alive without making it too bright. "This is nice," Jennifer said quietly, staring up at the stars. "Peaceful. I can see why people become hermits." I nodded, though something about the silence was starting to bother me. It was too complete, too perfect. No insects, no small animals rustling in the brush, no night sounds at all except the gentle babbling of the creek and the occasional pop from our fire. That's when I noticed our GPS unit was malfunctioning. I'd been checking it periodically throughout our hike, more out of habit than necessity since we were following the creek and couldn't really get lost. But now the screen showed our location as jumping erratically. One moment we were at our correct coordinates. The next, we were apparently 5 miles south, then 3 miles north, then back where we started. "Jen, look at this," I whispered, showing her the screen. She frowned, tapping the device with her finger. "Probably just the battery dying. These things are notoriously unreliable in remote areas anyway." But the battery indicator showed full power, and I'd charged it fully before we left. I tried turning it off and on again, but the problem persisted. Our location kept jumping around the map like we were teleporting. That's when we heard Jennifer scream. Except Jennifer was sitting right beside me, staring at the GPS with the same confused expression I probably had. The scream had come from somewhere downstream, back toward the campground we'd left that morning. It was definitely Jennifer's voice. I'd know that distinctive laugh-turned-shriek anywhere, but she was here, next to me, her mouth hanging open in shock. "What the fuck?" she whispered. The scream came again, closer this time. Definitely Jennifer's voice, but calling for help in a way that made my skin crawl. The words were wrong somehow, the inflection off, like someone doing an imperfect impression. David and Sarah were awake instantly, emerging from their tent with wide eyes and confused expressions. "Was that you?" David asked Jennifer. "No," she said, her voice barely audible, but it sounded exactly like me. We all stood in the firelight, listening intently. The sound came again, even closer now, Jennifer's voice calling, "Help me! Please, someone help me!" from somewhere just beyond the range of our firelight. "Stay together," David said quietly. "Everyone stay exactly where you are." But Sarah was already moving toward the sound, her instincts as a nurse overriding her caution. "Someone's hurt," she said. "We have to help." "Sarah, no." David grabbed her arm. "That's not a person. Listen to it." We all listened. The voice was calling for help, but there was something rhythmic about it, like a recording being played on loop. The same words, the same inflection, the same desperate tone, over and over again. "Help me! Please, someone help me!" And then, impossibly, we heard David's voice answering from the darkness. "We're coming! Stay where you are!" But David was standing right next to me, his hand clamped over his mouth in horror. "This is fucked," Jennifer whispered. "This is really, really fucked." The voices continued their conversation, Jennifer pleading for help and David promising to come find her, both voices moving slowly upstream into the canyon. But we were all standing together, all accounted for, all very much present and aware that something was using our voices in the darkness. "We're leaving," David said. "Right now. Pack everything. We're hiking out." "In the dark?" Sarah asked. "Through terrain we don't know?" "Yes, I don't care if we have to hike all night, we're not staying here." We broke camp in record time, stuffing gear into packs without our usual careful organization. The voices had faded upstream, but we could still hear them occasionally. Our own voices having a conversation we'd never had, calling out to each other from different directions in the canyon. But when we tried to leave, we found that the trail we'd used to hike in was gone. Not overgrown or washed out. Gone. Where there had been a clear path following the creek downstream toward the campground, there was now only dense brush and rocky walls too steep to climb. The creek itself seemed to have changed course, flowing in directions that made no geographic sense. David checked his compass obsessively, but it spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. The GPS was still jumping our location randomly across the map. Even our emergency beacon, when he tried to activate it, showed no signal. "This is impossible," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Trails don't just disappear. Compasses don't just stop working." "Maybe we're in the wrong canyon," Sarah suggested. "Maybe we got turned around somehow." But I knew we hadn't. I'd been paying attention to landmarks all day, noting the distinctive rock formations and the way the canyon walls curved. This was definitely where we'd made camp, but somehow the landscape had rearranged itself around us. We were trapped. We spent the rest of the night huddled together beside our rebuilt fire, taking turns trying to find a way out of the canyon. But every direction led to dead ends. Walls too steep to climb, brush too thick to penetrate, or drop-offs that disappeared into darkness. It was as if the canyon had closed itself around us like a fist. The voices continued throughout the night, sometimes close, sometimes distant. Always our voices, but saying things we'd never said, having conversations that felt wrong and twisted. At one point, I heard my own voice talking to someone deeper in the canyon, describing in detail how to find our campsite. "He's giving directions," I whispered to the others. "My voice is telling someone how to find us." "Who?" Jennifer asked. "Who's he talking to?" We never found out, but around 3 a.m, we started hearing footsteps. They were human footsteps, definitely human, but wrong in some fundamental way. The rhythm was off, sometimes too fast, sometimes with an extra step that shouldn't have been there. And they circled our camp just beyond the range of our firelight, round and round, never getting closer, but never going away. "Show yourself," David called out, his voice cracking slightly. "We know you're there." The footsteps stopped. Then, from the darkness just beyond our fire, we heard David's voice answer, "We know you're there." The same words, the same intonation, but spoken by something that wasn't David. That's when Jennifer started crying. Not the dramatic sobbing you might expect, but quiet, steady tears that she wiped away with shaking hands. "I want to go home," she whispered. "I just want to go home." Dawn came eventually, though it felt like the longest night of my life. With daylight, the landscape looked normal again. The same canyon, the same creek, the same rock formations. But when we tried to retrace our steps, every path led deeper into the wilderness instead of back toward civilization. Our maps had changed. I don't mean they were damaged or we were reading them wrong. I mean the actual printed features had shifted overnight. Trails that had been marked as leading southeast now showed as going northwest. Landmarks we'd noted were in different positions. It was as if the very geography was alive and malicious. "We need to signal for help," Sarah said. "Maybe if we get to higher ground, we can get a cell signal or use the mirror to reflect sunlight." We climbed out of the canyon, scrambling up the rocky walls until we reached a high point that should have given us a view for miles in every direction. But what we saw made no sense. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, the same rolling badlands and twisted rock formations as far as the eye could see. But there were no roads, no power lines, no signs of human civilization. It was as if the entire modern world had been erased, leaving only an endless expanse of wilderness. "Where's the campground?" Jennifer asked. "Where's the parking area? Where's the fucking road?" David was checking his GPS again, but now it wasn't even trying to lock onto satellites. The screen just showed a blank map with no coordinates, no landmarks, nothing. "The radio," Sarah said suddenly. "We brought an emergency radio. Maybe we can pick up a weather station or something." We climbed back down to our camp and dug out the emergency radio, cycling through every frequency. But instead of weather reports or emergency broadcasts, we found something that made my blood run cold. Static, white noise, and underneath it, very faintly, the sound of our own voices. Not the strange conversations we'd been hearing in the night. This was us, recorded from some time earlier. Our actual conversation from the previous day, when we'd been hiking into the canyon and discussing our planned route. But played back with subtle differences, words shifted around, emphasis changed, as if someone had been editing the recording. "Turn it off," Jennifer said. "Please turn it off." But before David could switch off the radio, we heard something new. My voice, but saying words I'd never spoken. "The hunger follows. The hunger always follows. You cannot run from what you have awakened." David threw the radio into the creek where it disappeared beneath the surface with barely a splash. We spent the second day trying to find a way out, but every attempt led us in circles. The canyon seemed to fold in on itself. Passages that led away in the morning somehow bringing us back to our campsite by afternoon. Our food supplies, which should have lasted 3 more days, were dwindling faster than they should have been. Water from the creek, despite all our purification efforts, left us feeling nauseated and weak. By evening, we were all beginning to show signs of strain. Jennifer had developed a nervous tic, constantly checking over her shoulder as if expecting something to be following her. Sarah had become obsessively protective of our remaining food, counting and recounting our supplies. David was still trying to maintain his leadership role, but I could see the panic in his eyes every time he thought no one was looking. And I was starting to hear things. Not the strange voices that had plagued us the night before, but whispers just at the edge of perception. Words in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood on a primal level. They spoke of hunger, of emptiness that could never be filled, of the terrible satisfaction of consuming what you loved most. The second night was worse than the first. The voices returned, but now they weren't just mimicking us, they were having conversations with us. When Jennifer called out, "Is anyone there?" something answered with Sarah's voice. "I'm here. I'm trapped." But Sarah was sitting right beside the fire, her eyes wide with terror. "Don't answer," David warned. "No matter what you hear, don't respond." But the thing using Sarah's voice was persistent. It called Jennifer's name, pleaded for help, described being injured and unable to move. The performance was perfect, every inflection exactly right, and I could see Jennifer struggling not to respond to what sounded like her friend in distress. That's when we realized the voices were getting closer. Throughout the first night, they'd maintained a respectful distance, staying just beyond our firelight. But now they were moving in, circling tighter, and we could sometimes see movement in the shadows at the very edge of our vision. "The fire," Sarah whispered. "Keep the fire burning. I don't think they can get too close to the fire." We fed our dwindling supply of wood to the flames. Making them burn higher and brighter than was probably wise given our situation. But it seemed to work. Whenever the voices got too close, a fresh log on the fire would drive them back. Around midnight, Jennifer volunteered to gather more firewood from the canyon walls where dead branches had collected in small alcoves. Despite our protests, she insisted she could see well enough by starlight and would stay close to camp. She disappeared into the darkness beyond our fire, and we could hear her moving around, snapping branches and collecting fuel. After about 10 minutes, she called back to us. "I found a whole pile of dry wood back here. This should keep us going all night," David called back. "Great, just be careful and get back here." "I'm coming," she replied. We waited, and waited. "Jennifer," Sarah called. "Where are you?" "I'm coming," came the reply, still from the same direction. But she never appeared. We called her name dozens of times over the next hour, and each time we heard her voice responding that she was coming, she'd found more wood. She'd be right there. But she never returned to the fire. When dawn broke, we searched everywhere she could have gone, calling her name and following her footprints in the soft earth. But the tracks led to a wall of rock that rose straight up from the canyon floor, impossible to climb, with no crevices or openings where a person could hide. Jennifer had simply vanished. "She has to be somewhere," Sarah insisted, her voice rising toward hysteria. "People don't just disappear." But as we searched, we started finding things that made no sense. Jennifer's backpack sitting neatly beside the creek as if she'd just set it down. Her water bottle, still half full, abandoned on a rock. Her hiking boots, laces tied, arranged side by side on a fallen log. It was as if she'd carefully removed her belongings and then ceased to exist. David was trying to maintain control, but I could see him fraying around the edges. He kept checking and rechecking our supplies, muttering about calories and water consumption and how long we could last. The rational part of his mind was still trying to solve our situation logically, but the fear was winning. "We have to consider the possibility," he said quietly as we sat beside our dwindling fire that third night, "that Jennifer is dead." Sarah whirled on him. "Don't say that. She's lost or hurt or something, but she's not dead." "Then where is she?" David asked. "Where are her tracks? How do you just disappear from a closed canyon?" I didn't want to voice what I was really thinking, that whatever had been using our voices the past 2 nights had finally figured out how to take one of us completely. But the thought hung in the air between us like smoke. That's when we heard Jennifer's voice calling from upstream. "Guys, I found something. You need to see this." We all looked at each other. The voice was definitely Jennifer's, with the same excitement she always got when she discovered something interesting. But we'd spent all day searching for her, finding nothing but abandoned belongings. "Jennifer," Sarah called back, "where have you been? We've been looking for you." "I found a way out," Jennifer's voice responded. "There's a cave back here that leads to another canyon. I can see lights. I think it's the campground." David grabbed my arm. "Don't move," he whispered. "Something's wrong." But Sarah was already standing, hope written across her face. "Jen? Really? You found a way out?" "Yes, but I need help. The opening is narrow and I dropped my flashlight. Can someone come help me?" The voice was coming from the same direction Jennifer had disappeared the night before, from the impossible rock wall where her tracks had ended. "I'm coming," Sarah called and started walking toward the sound. "Sarah, stop." David lunged after her, but she was already beyond the reach of our firelight. We heard her footsteps moving upstream, heard her calling Jennifer's name. Then we heard Jennifer's voice responding, directing Sarah deeper into the canyon. "This way, just a little further. I can see the lights." Their voices faded into the darkness, and then there was only silence. David and I sat by the fire, alone now, both of us too terrified to speak. We'd lost half our group to something that was using their voices to hunt us, and we had no idea how to fight it or escape it. "What is it?" I finally whispered. David shook his head. "I don't know, but I don't think it's human." We maintained our fire through the night, feeding it everything we could find. Neither of us slept. We just sat back to back, watching the darkness and listening for voices we knew we shouldn't trust. Around dawn, we heard them both, Jennifer and Sarah calling to us from the canyon walls. "Michael, David, we found the way out. Come on. There's a park ranger here. He has a radio. Hurry, before it gets light." The voices sounded exactly right. Jennifer's infectious enthusiasm, Sarah's practical urgency. If I hadn't seen their belongings scattered around our camp like trophies, I might have believed them. "Don't listen," David said, but his voice was shaking. "Whatever that thing is, it's got them. It's using them as bait." But even knowing it was a trap, the voices were almost impossible to resist. They knew us too well, used exactly the right words to trigger our hope and desperation. They described rescue in perfect detail, painted pictures of hot food and warm beds and phone calls home to worried families. "Please," Sarah's voice pleaded, "we can't find our way back to you. The ranger says we have to leave now or we'll miss our chance." David covered his ears, but I could see him wavering. The rational part of his mind knew it was wrong, but the exhausted, terrified part wanted to believe so badly that logic was starting to fail. That's when I noticed our food was gone. Not eaten, gone. Our entire cache of trail mix, energy bars, and dehydrated meals had vanished overnight. The containers were still there, still sealed, but completely empty. "David," I said, "look." He uncovered his ears and stared at the empty food containers, then at our water bottles, which were also mysteriously empty despite being full when we'd gone to sleep. "It's starving us," he said. understanding flooding his voice. Whatever this is, it's wearing us down, making us weak, making us desperate enough to follow those voices. The hunger hit both of us like a physical blow. We'd been burning calories constantly, hiking and climbing and staying awake in terror, and now our bodies were demanding fuel we didn't have. The emptiness in my stomach felt like it was trying to eat itself. "There's food upstream," Jennifer's voice called as if it could sense our need. "Berries and roots, clean water, just follow my voice." "We found a whole camp," Sarah added. "Someone left supplies, everything we need." My legs actually started moving before my brain caught up, the hunger driving me toward the sound of promised food. David grabbed my arm, his grip weak but desperate. "It knows," he whispered. "It can sense what we need, what we want. That's how it hunts." But knowing didn't make the hunger any easier to bear. My stomach cramped, my vision began to blur slightly, and the voices promising food and water and safety became harder and harder to ignore. We lasted until noon. That's when David broke. The hunger and exhaustion and terror finally overwhelmed his rational mind, and he stood up abruptly, his eyes focused on something I couldn't see. "I have to check," he said, "just to make sure. What if they really did find help?" "David, no." I tried to grab him, but he was already walking away from our fire toward the voices that had been calling all morning. "I'll be careful," he said. "I'll just look. If it's a trap, I'll come right back." But I knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't be coming back. I heard him calling to Jennifer and Sarah as he moved deeper into the canyon, heard their voices responding, guiding him, promising rescue and food and an end to our nightmare. Their conversation faded into the distance, leaving me alone beside our dying fire. I waited for hours, but David never returned. As evening approached, I found his belongings scattered near the creek just like the others. His pack, his jacket, his boots arranged neatly as if he'd simply stepped out of them and vanished. That night, alone by my fire, I heard all three of them calling to me. Jennifer's excited voice describing the cave system she'd found. Sarah's calm, medical assessment of my declining condition and her recommendations for treatment. David's authoritative commands to follow his voice to safety. They took turns, they called together, they pleaded and commanded and cajoled. They described rescue scenarios in perfect detail, painted pictures of helicopters and search teams and worried families. They promised everything I wanted to hear. But I stayed by my fire, alone, hungry, and terrified, because I'd finally understood what was hunting us. The Wendigo, the creature from indigenous folklore that the ranger had been afraid to name directly. The thing that fed on human flesh and took the voices of its victims to lure new prey. The monster born from starvation and desperation, from the terrible hunger that could drive people to consume what they loved most. It had been testing us from the beginning, learning our voices, understanding our relationships, mapping our psychology, the GPS malfunctions, the changed landscape, the impossible geography. All of it designed to trap us, to break us down, to make us desperate enough to follow false promises into its waiting hunger. And now it was wearing my friends like masks, using their voices to call me to join them in whatever horrible fate they'd met in the darkness. I fed my fire and tried not to listen. But as the night wore on, hunger and exhaustion began to take their toll. The voices became more persuasive, more detailed in their promises. They knew my favorite foods, my childhood comforts, the exact words that would cut through my resistance. Around midnight, I heard something new. My own voice, calling from the darkness. "Michael," it said, "come out here. You need to see this." It was my voice, but wrong somehow. Too hungry, too eager, like an imperfect recording played back through a broken speaker. "I found them," my voice continued. "Jennifer and Sarah and David. They're hurt, but they're alive. You need to help them." I pressed my hands to my ears, but I could still hear it. "Don't trust the fire," my voice said. The fire is the trap. It's keeping you weak, keeping you from seeing the truth. Come away from the fire." The hunger was like a living thing inside me now, clawing at my stomach, clouding my vision. I hadn't eaten anything in almost 2 days, and my body was starting to shut down non-essential functions. My hands shook as I fed another stick to the flames. "Look what I found," my voice called, and something heavy thudded to the ground just beyond the firelight. Despite every instinct screaming at me not to look, I couldn't help myself. I leaned forward, trying to see what had been thrown. It was a backpack, a familiar backpack. My backpack, the one I was currently wearing. I looked down at my shoulders, confirming that yes, I was still wearing my pack. But there, in the darkness, was an identical pack, sitting just beyond the reach of my fire. "See?" my voice said from the shadows. "You're not who you think you are. Come closer and I'll show you the truth." The hunger was making it hard to think clearly, but I knew this was wrong. I was me. I was Michael Williams, sitting by a fire in a canyon in North Dakota, the last survivor of a camping trip gone horribly wrong. Wasn't I? "You left yourself behind hours ago," my voice said gently. "You followed us into the dark and forgot to come back. The thing by the fire isn't you. It's just an echo, a shadow. Come home." I looked at my hands in the firelight. They seemed solid enough, real enough. But doubt was creeping in, joining the hunger and exhaustion in wearing down my defenses. What if I was the echo? What if the real me had already been taken, and I was just some kind of psychic residue doomed to sit by a fire that would eventually burn out? "I'm hungry," my voice said from the darkness, and I realized I'd been thinking the same thing. So hungry, and there's food here, fresh food, warm food. My stomach cramped violently and I doubled over in pain. The hunger was becoming everything, driving out rational thought, reducing me to pure animal need. "Just a taste," my voice whispered. "Just enough to ease the pain. No one will know." I found myself standing, drawn toward the sound of my own voice promising relief from the gnawing emptiness inside me. The fire seemed dimmer now, less important, just a barrier between me and the satisfaction I craved. But as I reached the edge of the firelight, I saw something that stopped me cold. Eyes. Dozens of eyes reflecting the firelight like an animal's, but arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. They weren't on a face. They were scattered across what might have been a torso, if a torso could be 10 feet tall and twisted into impossible angles. "Don't look," my voice said, but it was too late. I was looking at the Wendigo, the creature that had been hunting us, wearing our voices, consuming my friends. It stood just beyond my fire, a nightmare fusion of human and something else, something that had once been a person but had given in to the hunger and become something far worse. Its skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over bones that were too long and arranged in ways that defied anatomy. Its mouth was a tear in its face, filled with teeth that looked suspiciously human, and its hands ended in claws that gleamed with moisture I didn't want to identify. But the worst part was that I could see my friends in it. Jennifer's eyes scattered across its torso, Sarah's hands grafted onto its elongated arms, David's voice speaking from a mouth that wasn't quite in the right place. It had consumed them, absorbed them, made them part of itself, and now it was using their stolen pieces to hunt me. "You see," my voice said from the creature's impossible mouth. "You understand now. This is what happens when the hunger wins. But it doesn't hurt. It's actually quite peaceful." The fire flickered, running low on fuel. I had maybe an hour before it died completely, and then nothing would stand between me and the Wendigo. I could run, but I'd seen how that worked out for my friends. I could try to fight, but what weapons did I have against something that could rearrange geography and steal voices? Or I could feed the fire. Not with wood, I was almost out of wood. But fire needs fuel, and in extremity, any organic matter will burn. I looked at my backpack, my sleeping bag, my spare clothes, All synthetic materials that would burn hot and fast, maybe hot enough to drive the creature back, maybe hot enough to create a signal that someone, somewhere, might see. "What are you doing?" my voice asked as I began stuffing everything I owned into the fire. The flames leaped higher, fed by fabric and foam and all the gear I'd carefully selected for this trip. The Wendigo stumbled backward, its stolen eyes reflecting the sudden brightness. "That won't work," David's voice said from somewhere on the creature. "You can't burn forever." He was right. My improvised fuel would last maybe 30 minutes, but 30 minutes might be enough. I pulled out my emergency flare, the one piece of gear I'd forgotten about in all the panic and confusion. The instruction label was clear. Visible for 20 miles. Burns for 15 minutes. I yanked the pull cord and red light exploded around me, turning the canyon into a hellscape of crimson shadows and dancing flame. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound like tearing metal mixed with all three of my friends screaming in unison, and retreated further into the darkness. But I knew it would be back. Flares don't last forever, and my improvised fire was already starting to die down. That's when I heard the helicopter. At first, I thought it was just another trick, another false hope designed to lure me away from my fire. But the sound was wrong for that. Too mechanical. Too consistent. Too real. The Wendigo heard it too. It tilted its impossible head, listening, and for the first time since this nightmare began, it seemed uncertain. The helicopter circled the canyon twice before spotting my flare. I waved frantically, shouting at the top of my lungs as a searchlight swept across the canyon floor and locked onto my position. "Survivor located," a voice boomed from a loudspeaker. "Stay where you are. We're coming down." The Wendigo let out another shriek and began to retreat, moving with that impossible broken-jointed gait toward the deeper shadows of the canyon. But before it disappeared completely, it turned back to look at me one last time. Jennifer's eyes, Sarah's mouth, David's voice. "This isn't over, Michael. The hunger follows. The hunger always follows." Then it was gone, vanishing into the darkness like it had never been there at all. The rescue was efficient and professional. Search and Rescue had been looking for us since we'd failed to check in at the campground, though according to their GPS, our location was completely different from where I thought we'd been camping. They found me alone, suffering from severe dehydration and exposure, hallucinating from hunger and stress. They found no trace of my friends, no tracks, no belongings, no sign that Jennifer, Sarah, or David had ever been in the canyon. According to the official report, I'd been hiking alone and had become disoriented after falling and hitting my head. The scattered gear I'd sworn belonged to my missing friends was identified as my own belongings, somehow distributed around the canyon through my confused wandering. They were very kind about it. Trauma does strange things to memory, they explained. Isolation and hunger can cause vivid hallucinations. The human brain often creates elaborate false memories to explain experiences it can't process logically. I was hospitalized for a week, fed and hydrated and counseled about the dangers of solo hiking in remote areas. The psychiatrist assigned to my case was particularly interested in my auditory hallucinations, the voices I'd heard calling my name in the darkness. No one believed me about the Wendigo. No one believed my friends had ever been there with me. And why would they? I had no proof, no photos of us together on the trip, no witnesses who'd seen us leave Minneapolis as a group, no rental agreements or campground reservations in multiple names. It was as if Jennifer, Sarah, and David had been erased not just from the canyon, but from reality itself. Except for one thing. When I got home and checked my phone, the phone that had shown no signal in the canyon, I found dozens of text messages from numbers I didn't recognize, messages that had been sent during the nights I'd spent trapped in the canyon. "The hunger follows," read one. "You cannot run from what you have awakened," read another. "We're still here, Michael, still hungry, still waiting." The messages continue to arrive, usually late at night when I'm trying to sleep. Different numbers each time, but always the same voices when I try to call back. Jennifer's laugh, Sarah's calm medical tone, David's authoritative commands, and sometimes, in the mirror or in the reflection of a window, I catch glimpses of eyes that aren't quite my own, hands that move slightly out of sync with my movements, a mouth that smiles when I'm not smiling. I think the Wendigo didn't just take my friends, I think it took part of me too. And someday, when I'm weak enough, hungry enough, desperate enough, it will call me back to that canyon to finish what it started. The hunger follows, after all. The hunger always follows.